In a blizzard so thick it erased the road, a poor old carpenter saw a starving German shepherd standing over a barefoot Navy SEAL half buried in snow. Every other driver had passed. Silas Whitaker stopped anyway, never knowing that one small mercy would uncover a betrayal, save a broken warrior, and turn an old workshop into a home for the forgotten. Snow fell so hard over the back road outside McCall, Idaho, that the whole world seemed to have been rubbed out with a white cloth. The pines along the edge of Payette National Forest leaned beneath the weight of it, their black branches cracking now and then with a sound like old bones shifting in sleep. Silas Whitaker drove his battered green pickup through the storm, with both hands resting lightly on the wheel. Not because the road was easy, but because panic had never once made ice less slippery. He was 79 years old, thin as a fence rail, with a white beard trimmed close to his weathered jaw, and hands that looked as if every board in Idaho had left a little argument in them. The heater worked when it remembered to. The wipers moved with the tired rhythm of a man sawing through a knot. In the truck bed, 3 warped planks and a sack of stove pellets thumped against each other each time the tires found a frozen rut. Silas had been to a widow's house on the north edge of town, fixing a porch step she swore was fine until her pastor nearly disappeared through it. He had taken no money, only a jar of peach preserves and a warning that the storm would get worse before midnight. He should have gone straight home, he knew that. Everyone in Valley County knew better than to linger when snow came down in sheets and the sky lost its edges. Still, Silas drove slowly, watching the ditch as much as the road because winter had a way of hiding trouble in plain sight. The first thing he saw was not a man. It was a dog. A German shepherd stood in the center of the road, half ghost and half soldier, his sable coat plastered with snow and ice, black saddle dark against the white. His ribs showed when the wind lifted his fur. One front paw hovered just above the ground, trembling, stained pink at the toes. Around his neck hung a silver military working dog collar, so scratched that the numbers were nearly gone. The dog did not bark when Silas rounded the bend. He simply squared himself in front of the truck headlights and stared through the blizzard as if he had been appointed keeper of the mountain and would sooner freeze there than surrender his post. Silas eased his foot onto the brake. The pickup slid 3 feet, then 4, then settled with a groan. The dog did not move. "Well now," Silas whispered, and killed the engine. In the sudden quiet, the storm sounded louder, snow ticking against the windshield, wind worrying at the door seals. Silas opened the door slowly and stepped down into snow that swallowed his boots to the ankle. The cold went through his coat at once. He left both hands where the dog could see them. "I am not here to take anything from you," he said. His voice came out calm, a little rough from years of sawdust and black coffee. The shepherd lowered his head and growled, not mean, not wild. It was the sound of a tired guardian saying there was one line left in the world, and he was it. Then Silas saw the shape behind him. At first it looked like a fallen pack or a snow-covered stump beside the ditch. The headlights caught a bare hand blue-white at the knuckles, half buried near a drift. Silas felt the old familiar drop inside his chest, the one that had visited him years ago when a deputy came to his porch before dawn and held his hat too tightly. He took 1 step forward. The shepherd came with him, blocking the way, teeth visible now, but body shaking so badly that snow fell from his shoulders in little clumps. "All right," Silas murmured. "You have been doing your job. I can respect that." He backed to the truck, keeping his face turned toward the dog, and pulled his canvas coat from the seat. It was older than some churches, patched at both elbows, smelling of cedar shaving smoke and the peppermint candies Grace Holloway kept dropping into his pockets at the diner. Silas did not toss it. Tossing startled hurt animals. He knelt, though his knees objected like unpaid bills, and laid the coat on the snow between himself and the dog. "If that was my child down there," he said, his voice barely louder than the wind, "I would pray somebody stopped." even if they had every reason to keep driving. The shepherd's ears shifted, his amber eyes with Silas to the coat, then back to the figure in the ditch. There are moments in life that do not look holy while they are happening. They look clumsy, they look cold, they look like an old man kneeling in a road bargaining with a starving dog while snow crawls inside his collar. Silas waited. He had learned from Wood that pressure could ruin what patience might save. He had learned from grief that nothing living should be rushed when it was deciding whether to trust the world again. At last, the dog stepped aside, 3 inches, no more. But it was enough. Silas moved forward on one knee, then the other until he reached the man. The stranger lay on his side, broad-shouldered, wearing only torn thermal gear and soaked tactical pants that had frozen stiff along the seams. He was barefoot. His feet were cut and darkened by cold, one ankle badly swollen. Snow had collected in his hair, which was dark brown and cropped close, with a scatter of silver at the temples. A narrow scar marked the line near his jaw. His lips were cracked. His face carried bruises, yellowing beneath fresher purple, and yet even half-frozen, even abandoned in a ditch, he had the strange dignity of a man who had spent his life standing up when others ducked. Silas pressed 2 fingers to the man's throat. Nothing for 1 breath. Then faintly, a pulse. He let out air he had not realized he was holding. "There you are," he whispered. The shepherd pushed close, whining, now a thin, broken sound that did not match the guard he had been a moment before. Silas looked at him. "You kept him alive, did you?" The dog blinked snow from his lashes and leaned his head against the man's shoulder. Silas pulled a wool blanket from the truck, tucked it around the stranger, then wrapped his canvas coat over the shepherd's back. The dog accepted it with visible suspicion, as if kindness were a trick he had seen performed badly before. It took Silas nearly 10 minutes to get the man out of the ditch. He was not a young man anymore, and the stranger was built like someone who had hauled boats, weapons, and other men through places that did not forgive weakness. Twice Silas slipped. Once the shepherd caught the stranger's sleeve in his teeth and pulled backward, helping with a fierce little grunt. "You are a bossy fellow," Silas said. The dog ignored him. Silas liked him immediately. By the time Silas dragged the man into the passenger side of the pickup, his own lungs burned. He checked the ditch again for a wallet, a pack of boots, anything that belonged to a life. There was nothing. No phone, no identification, no dog tags, no tire tracks left clean enough to read, the storm working over every mark like an accomplice with a broom. He found only one small thing snagged inside the torn fabric near the man's hip, a short length of black cord with a knot pattern. Silas did not recognize but knew was not decoration. He tucked it into the cup holder without thinking. The shepherd jumped in after the man and squeezed himself awkwardly between the dashboard and the man's knees, refusing the back seat, refusing distance, refusing every law of comfort. "Suit yourself," Silas told him, climbing behind the wheel. The dog stared. "You will find I talk to animals in lumber because both answer more honestly than people. That earned no wag. Not yet." Silas turned the key. The engine coughed and rattled like a jar of bolts. The gas needle sat too close to empty. The road home was 12 miles of snow timber and bad decisions. Silas looked at the unconscious man, then at the dog whose eyes had not left him. "Lord," he said softly, "I am going to need the tires to remember their manners." The drive back toward McCall took nearly an hour. The storm erased the road behind them so quickly that it seemed less like travel than being swallowed forward. Silas kept the heater blowing full, though the cab never became warm. The stranger stirred once, a deep breath catching in his throat. His hand jerked toward an absent holster, then fell. The shepherd pressed his muzzle into the man's palm until the fingers curled weakly against his fur. "Calm now," Silas said, not sure which of them he meant. In the shifting glow of the dashboard, he noticed more signs. The man's posture, even limp, held discipline. His wrists showed pale bands where something had been removed. His feet were not simply bare from accident. The boots had been taken. People did not lose boots in a blizzard unless someone wanted them, unable to walk out of it. Silas had lived long enough to know cruelty often dressed itself as inconvenience. A body in a ditch could be called a drunk, a vagrant, a fool who wandered. But the dog knew better. Silas trusted the dog. Outside, the forest opened briefly to a view of the frozen lake, invisible except for the way the darkness widened. McCall lay beyond it, a small scatter of lights trying their best against the storm. At the edge of town, Silas almost drove to the clinic. Then the stranger began muttering just one word, hoarse and cracked. "No." His body stiffened in panic. The shepherd rose instantly, paused slipping on the floor mat, and growled at the windshield as if the idea itself had entered the truck. Silas slowed. The clinic would ask for identification. They would call the sheriff, maybe the county, maybe somebody farther away. Most of the time that was right. Tonight, looking at the missing boots, the bruises, the military collar, and the dog who had nearly died guarding this man from the world, Silas decided the world could wait until morning. He turned toward his workshop on Larkspur Lane, a low building behind his small house where the stove still held embers and the spare cot was covered with clean quilts. He would warm the man first. He would call Doc Avery, who still made house visits, if Grace bullied him properly. He would ask questions later, and only the ones that needed asking. As he pulled into his yard, the storm thickened until the truck disappeared from the road behind a curtain of white. Miles away, in an office lit by fluorescent lights, a stolen phone buzzed on a desk. A message appeared under Caleb Mercer's name, brief, cold, and false. "I am done. Do not look for me." By dawn, men who had served beside him would read it and wonder how a Navy SEAL had vanished without honor, while the man himself lay unconscious in an old carpenter's house, still fighting for one more breath. Morning came to McCall under a sky the color of tin, with snow still falling in small, stubborn flakes that tapped the workshop windows like fingers asking to be let in. Behind Silas Whitaker's house, the old stove breathed orange light into a room crowded with benches, clamps, hand planes, jars of bent nails, and pieces of wood too flawed for customers, but too interesting for Silas to throw away. Caleb Mercer woke to the smell of cedar shavings, wood smoke, and chicken broth. For 1/2 second he did not remember the cold, the ditch, the dog, the coffee that had tasted wrong, or the voice that had told him to sit down before he embarrassed himself. Training arrived before memory. His hand shot out and caught the wrist of the man leaning over him, hard. The old man did not yelp, though pain tightened his mouth. He simply froze with a chipped blue bowl in his other hand and said, "If you break that wrist, breakfast gets much harder to serve." Caleb blinked. The room swam. Bishop rose from beside the cot with a growl that turned into a confused whine when he realized the threat was also the person holding soup. Caleb released Silas as if the skin had burned him. "Where am I?" His voice scraped out like gravel under a shovel. "My shop," Silas said. "McCall, Idaho. You were trying to become part of a snowbank and your dog disagreed with the plan." Caleb tried to sit up. The room tilted left, then right, then narrowed to a bright coin of pain behind his eyes. He swung his legs over the cot anyway, because lying down made him feel pinned. His feet were wrapped in clean strips of flannel. The flesh beneath throbbed with a hot, ugly pulse. His ribs protested when he breathed too deeply. Bishop stepped close, sable fur brushing his knee, the dog's body still too thin beneath the blanket Silas had draped over him. Caleb touched the torn ear, the old scar there, the living proof that at least one thing had not been taken from him. Bishop, he whispered. The dog pushed his head into Caleb's chest and made a sound that belonged somewhere between relief and complaint. Silas set the bowl on a stool. He has been staring at you for 11 hours. I tried explaining that I am not a villain, but he seems to be waiting for references. Caleb looked at him, then really looked. Silas was tall but narrow, his back curved from years of leaning over work, his white beard neat, his eyes pale blue and steady in a face carved by weather rather than softness. He wore a red flannel shirt under suspenders and moved like a man whose joints had filed grievances but had not yet won. Caleb had trusted men in uniforms who betrayed him. Trusting an old carpenter with soup seemed absurd. Still, the soup steamed. I need a phone, Caleb said. You need broth, Silas replied. Phone after. Caleb's jaw tightened. You do not understand. That is true most mornings, until coffee. Silas picked up a mug from the bench and took a sip. But I understand fever frostbite and a man about to stand up when his body has already voted no. Caleb looked toward the door. Bishop moved with him, blocking the path by instinct. The humiliation of it struck harder than the pain. He had led men through surf so cold it stole language from their mouths. He had carried a wounded teammate across a street that was coming apart under machine fire. He had once stayed awake for 3 days because other people needed him alert. Now he could not cross a workshop without a dog and an old man deciding whether he was allowed. His hands shook. Not from fear. Not entirely from cold. He gripped the edge of the cot until his knuckles blanched. Silas pretended not to notice, which was its own small mercy. Eat, the old man said. Then I will tell you what I found, and what I did not. Caleb hated how reasonable that sounded. He hated more that his stomach folded in on itself at the smell of broth. He took the bowl. Grace Holloway arrived just after 9, though. The roads were still mean, and the snowplows were losing their argument with the sky. She came through the side door without knocking, carrying a canvas bag and a covered dish, her gray hair twisted into a low knot under a knitted cap the color of cranberries. Silas, if you froze to death because you were too stubborn to call, I am taking back the pie dish you never returned, she called, then stopped when she saw Caleb on the cot and Bishop rising between them. Grace did not flinch. She had run a diner for 41 years, which meant she had faced men drunk, grieving, hungry, proud, and sometimes all four before noon. Well, she said, eyeing Bishop, you are handsome, but you look like you would judge my biscuits. Bishop gave one low woof. Grace nodded solemnly. Fair, last batch was dry. Against his will, Caleb almost smiled. Almost. Grace set the bag down and pulled out cornbread, bandages, canned peaches, and a paper sack of beef scraps wrapped for the dog. Bishop sniffed the meat, looked at Caleb for permission, and when Caleb nodded, accepted it with the solemnity of receiving military orders. Silas watched the exchange. There. He trusts you more than me. Grace snorted. That is because he has taste. The radio on the shelf crackled under a layer of dust and sawdust. Silas kept it low most days, more for company than news, but the storm had made local updates necessary. A county announcer listed school closures, road closures, warnings about roof weight, and a reminder to check on elderly neighbors. Grace muttered that elderly neighbors were currently feeding half the county. Caleb ate slowly, each swallow returning him by inches to his body. He searched his mind for sequence. Warehouse lights, a clipboard, the sharp smell of plastic wrap around crates. Damon Pierce smiling with only half his mouth. A plate of supposed ballistic armor that felt wrong in his hand. Not weight. Balance. He had learned to trust weight. This batch is counterfeit, Caleb had said. Someone behind him stopped moving. Later, coffee, a conference room too warm, the bitterness on his tongue. Bishop barking somewhere beyond a door. Then cold so complete it seemed to live inside his bones. Caleb set the bowl down. "What did you find on me?" Silas wiped his hands on a towel. "No wallet, no phone, no boots, no tags, no weapon. One piece of black cord tied in a fancy knot, bruises that do not look like falling, feet that look like somebody wanted you unable to walk far." He paused. "And one dog who looked ready to argue with God if God reached for you too quickly." Caleb closed his eyes. Dog tags gone. Phone gone. Identification gone. The absence had shape. It had intent. "I am active duty," he said, then corrected himself because the truth mattered. "Navy, special warfare. I was weeks from retirement." Grace's face softened but did not melt into pity. Silas simply nodded as if Caleb had said he worked roofs or repaired engines. "Name?" the old man asked. Caleb hesitated. Names could be used, names could be searched, names could drag trouble to doorways that had only offered warmth. Bishop leaned harder against his leg. Caleb exhaled. "Caleb Mercer." Grace repeated it once under her breath, not dramatically, just placing him into the room properly. "Then, Caleb Mercer," Silas said, "you are going to sit there and let Doc Avery look at your feet before you go saving the Republic." "I cannot stay here." "Probably true in the long run." Silas lifted another split log and fed the stove. "But you can stay until noon." Caleb stared. "Noon. I find most disasters are still disasters after lunch. Gives a man time to put on socks." Grace laughed a short, warm burst that made Bishop's ears flick. Caleb did not laugh. But something inside his chest loosened a notch he had not authorized. Doc Avery came through the snow an hour later, grumbling before he crossed the threshold. He was an 80-year-old physician who had retired 3 times and failed at it because people kept being inconsiderate enough to get sick. He examined Caleb's feet, ribs, pupils, and blood pressure, while Bishop watched as if memorizing legal violations. "Frostbite, but not as bad as it tried to be," Avery said. "Dehydration, bruised ribs, possible concussion. Infection risk on the cuts. You should be in a hospital." Caleb said no. Avery looked at Silas. Silas looked at the stove. Grace looked at Caleb with the expression of a woman deciding whether a sermon would be worth the breath. "Hospital means paperwork," Avery said quietly. "Paperwork means calls. Calls mean whoever took his boots may learn he still has feet." The room changed. The old doctor had named the thing everyone else had been circling. Silas nodded once. "Can you treat him here?" Avery sighed with the long-suffering pride of a man about to do exactly that. "I can keep him from dying if he does not insist on helping death out of courtesy." Caleb looked away. Bishop placed one paw on his bandaged foot very gently. Grace whispered, "Good boy." Caleb whispered the same thing, but so softly only Bishop heard it. After Doc Avery left, Silas set a small pile of split wood beside the stove and pointed toward a second stack near the wall. "If you are determined to stand, move those 6 pieces over here." Caleb looked at him offended. "That is it?" "No, the 8th piece is advanced work. We start slow in this institution." Caleb rose with the stiff care of a man pretending pain was a rumor. Bishop shadowed him so closely Caleb nearly tripped over him. The first log weighed almost nothing compared to the loads he had carried in service, yet by the 4th his breath had shortened. Sweat chilled his back. He hated every second. He also needed it. The movement gave his anger somewhere to go besides his teeth. Silas watched from the bench, shaving a curl from a scrap of maple with a pocket knife. "Wood tells on a man," he said. Caleb set down the 6th log. "Does it?" "Sure. A man who is scared grips too tight. A man who is ashamed cuts too deep. A man who wants to disappear sands until there is nothing left. Caleb looked at the old carpenter then. Silas was not looking back. He was studying the maple, where a thin, dark crack ran down one side. He marked the crack with a blue pencil, not to hide it, but to notice it. "What do you do with that?" Caleb asked. "Depends," Silas said. "Some cracks mean the board is done. Some are where the interesting part begins." The radio interrupted before Caleb could answer. The announcer's voice shifted from weather to a regional bulletin. Authorities were seeking information on Master Chief Special Warfare Operator Caleb Mercer, reported absent without authorization after failing to return from a logistics inspection connected to winter deployment supplies. Caleb stood very still. Grace reached toward the radio, but Silas lifted one hand, stopping her. The announcer continued. A preliminary statement suggested Mercer may have left voluntarily. No threat to the public was believed to exist. Anyone with information was asked to contact military authorities. Silence followed thick as the snowbank outside. Caleb's face emptied in the way of men who have learned not to give pain witnesses. Inside, though, something tore. They had moved quickly, too quickly. The false message, the missing tags, the stolen boots, the clean little phrase left voluntarily. Bishop began to growl, low and continuous. Grace's eyes flashed with anger. "Left voluntarily without shoes in a blizzard. That is the stupidest lie I have heard before noon, and I run a diner." Silas turned the radio off. He did not ask Caleb if it was true. That mattered more than any speech. He only picked up his blue pencil, marked the crack in the maple once more, and said, "Well, Mr. Mercer, seems someone is trying to decide what shape your story is." Caleb looked at the snow pressed against the window, then at Bishop, then at the old man whose wrist he had nearly broken over soup. "They already have," he said. Silas shook his head. "No, they just cut the first line wrong. Outside, the storm kept falling, covering the roads, the tracks, and the truth." The storm passed before noon the next day, leaving McCall wrapped in a silence so complete that even the lake seemed to be holding its breath beneath the ice. Snow lay deep against Silas Whitaker's workshop, piled halfway up the windows bright where the sun touched it, and blue in every shadow. Caleb Mercer stood beside the door with a borrowed coat hanging loose over his shoulders, staring at the road as if he could force it open by will. The fever had broken during the night, but weakness lingered in him like a bad smell. His bandaged feet would not fit into Silas's spare boots, so Grace had produced a pair of wool slippers with rubber soles and dared him to complain. He had not. Special operators were trained to endure discomfort, but no training prepared a man for being rescued in slippers by a woman who smelled faintly of cinnamon and fryer grease. Bishop sat beside him, sable coat brushed clean now, ribs still showing, but eyes sharper. The dog watched the road too, though every few seconds he checked Caleb's face, measuring the weather inside the man. "I need to leave," Caleb said. Silas, who was clearing snow from the porch with a flat shovel, did not look up. "Road is closed. Then I walk. In those slippers?" Caleb's jaw tightened. Silas scraped another load of snow aside. "That would be a story. Not a wise one, but memorable." Caleb hated the old man's calm because it left him nowhere honorable to put his anger. He wanted orders opposition, a door to kick open. He wanted Damon Pierce in front of him and the stolen phone in his hand. He wanted whoever had signed that false report to look him in the eye. Instead, he had Snowpain, a dog who refused to stop worrying, and a carpenter who treated urgency like a board that needed drying before it could be worked. "You do not know what this means," Caleb said. "Men I served with are reading that bulletin. My command is reading it. My name is being dragged through mud I am not even well enough to crawl out of." Silas leaned on the shovel. "Snow, technically." Caleb turned. "This is not funny." "No," Silas said. "It is not. But if I let every cruel thing steal the last dry scrap of humor from me, I would have frozen solid 30 years ago. The words landed strangely. Caleb looked away. He knew men who made jokes in firefights, not because death was amusing, but because breath needed somewhere to stand. Still being laughed near was hard when shame had its teeth in him. "I am not staying hidden," he said. "Good," Silas replied. "Hide too long and you start decorating the cave. But standing still for a day is not the same as surrender." To prove a point Caleb did not yet understand, Silas took him into the workshop and set a plank of pine on the main bench. The board was pale, almost golden, with a dark crack running crookedly from one end toward the center. Silas slid an old handplane toward him. Its wooden handle had been polished by decades of palms smooth as river stone. "Make that side level," he said. Caleb looked at the tool. "I am not a carpenter, neither was I before I ruined several trees." Caleb picked up the plane because refusing felt childish and because his hands needed something besides fists. He set the blade against the wood and pushed with controlled strength. The tool bit too deep, stopped hard, and sent a harsh scrape through the room. Bishop sneezed at the dust, then looked betrayed by the entire craft. Silas did not smile. Caleb lifted the plane and saw a gouge he had carved beside the crack. "I damaged it. You introduced yourself poorly," Silas said. "There is a difference." He adjusted the blade a fraction, barely enough for Caleb to notice. "You went at it like the board had orders to obey. It is wood." "Yes, and yet here it is resisting command structure." That one almost got Caleb. Almost. Silas demonstrated one pass. His hands looked too old for precision until they moved, then age became music. The plane skimmed forward, raising a thin ribbon of pine that curled over itself and fell at Caleb's feet. "Hear that?" Silas asked. Caleb listened. The next pass whispered instead of scraped. That is what happens when the blade stops arguing with the grain. Caleb did not want a lesson. He got one anyway, not as a speech, but as sound, scent, and the pale curl of wood in his palm. He tried again, lighter this time. The plane moved 3 inches, caught, then slid. Another shaving lifted ragged, but real. Bishop sniffed it, sneezed again, and stepped back with offended dignity. Silas nodded toward the dog. "He thinks your first attempt was vulgar." Caleb's mouth betrayed him. A brief smile appeared there and gone. It startled him more than pain had. For months, maybe years, smiles had been rationed in him. He had given men confidence, not laughter. He had given orders, not ease. Now a dog sneezing at pine dust had cracked something open. He set the plane down. "What is the point of this?" Silas marked the board's crack with his blue pencil. "You keep looking at the door because you think the only honest work is out there, hunting the men who hurt you. Maybe it is, later. But right now the first thing needing repair is standing at my bench pretending he is fine." Grace arrived at midday with a pot of stew and a list of things that had broken at her diner, which she claimed was not the same as asking for free labor. "The back chair by the pie case has developed a personal grudge against hips," she said, setting the pot on Silas's stove. "And 2 tables wobble like they are testifying under oath." Caleb stayed quiet while she talked, but he noticed the shadows under her eyes and the ledger tucked under one arm. Grace Holloway was 67, round-cheeked, but not soft with the kind of posture that came from carrying trays through crowded rooms without spilling coffee or opinions. She ran Holloway's Table on Pine Street, a narrow diner with fogged windows, red vinyl stools, and a bell above the door that sounded tired by breakfast. Silas later told Caleb that Grace also ran the church food pantry by force of personality and stubborn bookkeeping. Every Thursday night she served free dinners to old widows, lonely veterans, Teenagers pretending they were not hungry, and anybody else who knew how to sit down without causing trouble. "Donations are thin this winter," Silas said after she left the room to wash bowls. "Storms make people generous in theory and cautious in practice." Caleb glanced toward the ledger. "Why keep doing it?" Silas looked at him as if the question were not foolish, just unfinished. "Because hunger is not always in the stomach." That afternoon, Grace persuaded Silas to bring Caleb to the diner under the pretense of measuring chairs. Caleb resisted until Bishop nudged his bandaged foot and made the decision unpopular. They drove slowly through town, past roofs buried in snow smoke, rising from chimneys, children carving tunnels through drifts beside the school, and storefronts with hand-lettered signs promising hot coffee to plow drivers. McCall looked peaceful, in the way small towns can look from a distance, as if grief and debt and secrets had politely agreed to remain indoors. Inside the diner, warmth hit Caleb first, followed by the smell of coffee, cooked too long, beef gravy, lemon dish soap, and something sweet cooling on a rack. 3 old men at the counter went quiet when he entered. A teenage waitress stared at Bishop with open delight. Grace clapped her hands. "Do not make a production. He is here to look at my treacherous furniture." Caleb kept his back near a wall. He counted exits before he knew he was doing it. Bishop sat on his left, between him and the room. Silas pretended to study a chair. The old men resumed arguing about snow tires, though one slid a plate of biscuits toward Caleb without meeting his eyes. No one asked his rank. No one asked why he walked like every step had a memory under it. The restraint unsettled him more than questions would have. The chair by the pie case was worse than Grace had admitted. One rear leg had split near the joint, and the seat creaked under Silas's hand. Caleb knelt carefully, ignoring the protest in his ribs. He saw the crack before he touched it. A clean break would have been simpler. This one wandered through the grain like it had been deciding for years where to fail. "It can be fixed," Silas said. Caleb ran a thumb along the split. "Or replaced." Grace, passing with a coffee pot, said, "You military men always go straight to replacement. That chair has heard more confessions than my pastor." Silas chuckled. Caleb looked up. "Confessions." Grace lowered her voice, though nobody was close. "People tell pie things they would never tell God. Pie does not interrupt." Caleb did smile then. Small but undeniable, Bishop chose that moment to steal a broken biscuit from under the counter, and the teenage waitress gasped like she had witnessed a royal ceremony. For a few minutes, Caleb was not a wanted deserter in a borrowed coat. He was a man kneeling on a diner floor holding a cracked chair while an old woman defended its dignity and his dog committed low-level theft. Near closing, as Grace locked the front door against the early dark, Bishop began nosing the snow piled beside the alley. At first, Caleb thought he had found another biscuit. Then the dog's posture changed. Head low, tail still, shoulders forward. Caleb forgot his feet and moved too quickly, pain flashing white up his legs. Bishop dug through the crusted snow with both front paws, scattering ice against the brick wall. Silas came with a flashlight. Under 3 inches of fresh powder lay a short strip of red plastic, stiff with cold, printed with a partial serial code. Caleb stopped breathing for a moment. He had seen that color. Not on diner trash. Not on anything in Silas's yard. Red zip seals had been used on the winter deployment equipment at the warehouse, each one numbered, each one meant to prove a crate had not been opened. This piece had been cut, not torn. The edge was sharp. Caleb picked it up with 2 fingers. Memory broke through like a boot through ice. A crate. A clipboard. Damon Pierce saying, "You are making this harder than it needs to be." A second man sleeved brushing past him. Navy blue cuff. Gold ring. Coffee steam. Then nothing. "What is it?" Silas asked. Caleb looked down the alley where snow had already softened every footprint. Proof someone from that warehouse came near this town. Bishop stared into the dark, the fur along his spine raised. From the street beyond the diner, an engine turned over, idled for 3 seconds, then drove away without headlights. Snow began again before dawn, softer than the first blizzard, but more patient, filling the old tracks around McCall until yesterday looked like a rumor. The workshop roof groaned under its white load, and the stove inside Silas Whitaker's shop burned low and steady, warming the boards stacked along the wall until the air smelled of pine pitch coffee and wet wool. Caleb Mercer sat at the bench with the red zip seal on a clean rag in front of him. He had not slept much. Each time he closed his eyes, the warehouse returned in fragments, never enough to hold, always enough to cut. Bishop lay beneath the bench with his injured paw stretched out, watching the door, even in sleep. The dog had eaten 2 full meals now and accepted water from Grace, but the old habit of vigilance clung to him like burrs in fur. Silas moved around the shop without asking questions. That was one of his stranger gifts. Most people tried to pry stories out of pain, as if naming a wound gave them ownership of it. Silas simply sharpened chisels, sorted screws, and waited. The waiting filled the room until Caleb could either speak or choke on his own silence. He picked up the red plastic strip. "I opened a crate," he said. Silas kept his eyes on the whetstone. "All right." "It was supposed to be winter deployment equipment," Caleb continued. "Ballistic plates rated for cold impact, emergency heaters, medical compression kits, sealable blood warmers, batteries that would not die at high altitude, gear for teams operating where weather kills faster than bullets." His voice stayed even because he made it stay even. The paperwork matched, the serial manifests matched, the weights were close enough to fool anyone who did not handle that kind of gear for a living. But one plate felt wrong. The balance was off. I cut the seal. He saw it again, the fluorescent warehouse light, the plastic smell, his knife sliding through, red. Inside the plate had carried the right stamp and the wrong sole. Cheap composite, bad edge finish, a thing pretending to save a life while waiting to fail. I found 3 bad plates in the first crate, then missing supplies in the medical kits, heaters with counterfeit battery cells. Someone had built death into the shipment and dressed it as compliance. Silas set the chisel down. The small click seemed loud. "Who saw you find it?" Caleb's jaw worked once. "Damon Pierce, contractor, civilian, polished expensive watch, soft hands. He acted surprised, then helpful, said we needed to document everything, said there might be a simple explanation." Caleb laughed once without humor. There was greed. He told Silas what he remembered next. A meeting in a small conference room, coffee already poured. Pierce apologizing for the inconvenience. A senior officer Caleb had not expected to see standing partly behind him, face hidden at first by glare on the glass wall. Caleb remembered a gold ring tapping the table. He remembered Bishop barking somewhere outside the room, sharp and furious. Then the bitterness on his tongue. His fingers failing to close around his phone. The floor coming toward him in a calm, distant way. "When I woke up, it was night," he said. "Cold. No boots, no tags. Bishop was there. I do not know how he got loose." Bishop lifted his head at his name, ears pricked. Caleb reached down and touched the dog's neck. "He found me, or he never lost me." Silas wiped metal dust from the chisel with a cloth. "There is a difference." Caleb looked at Bishop. Not to him. For the first time, his voice changed. It roughened at the edges. Silas heard the guilt in it before Caleb named it. "Those supplies were going to people I know, maybe people I train. If I had missed it." He stopped. His hands curled around the edge of the bench. "You did not miss it," Silas said. "They made sure you paid for noticing." Caleb looked at him with a flash of anger. That does not make the gear real. It does not protect anyone. No, Silas said. But it means the crack started with them, not you. After breakfast, Silas asked Caleb to ride with him to the cemetery. Caleb almost refused. He was tired of being guided toward lessons he had not agreed to learn. But Silas did not use a gentle voice or a meaningful look. He only put on his coat, picked up a small broom, and said, "Road is passable. Bishop can come if he keeps his opinions out of the flower beds." Bishop clearly had no intention of doing so, but he climbed into the truck anyway. The cemetery sat on a hill above town, where pines thinned enough to reveal the frozen lake and the roofs of McCall tucked below like dark buttons on white cloth. Snow covered the stones in soft caps. Silas carried no flowers. Flowers froze. Instead, he carried a small cedar cross he had carved no bigger than his palm, its edges left rough on purpose so the grain showed through. Caleb followed slowly, every step tugging at the cuts in his feet. Bishop ranged ahead, then came back, unwilling to let either man move unguarded through a place so quiet. Silas stopped before a simple granite marker and brushed the snow away with the little broom. Hannah Elise Whitaker, beloved daughter, beloved healer. Caleb read the dates. She had been 32. Too young. Everyone in cemeteries was either too young or left someone who thought so. She was an army nurse, Silas said. Not the kind who liked speeches. She could start an IV in the dark and make a colonel apologize to a private if he needed it. His mouth softened around the memory. She came home one January to help with a flu outbreak at the nursing home. On her way back up the pass, a truck lost control. The ambulance behind her stopped. Somebody else did not. He placed the cedar cross at the base of the stone. Snow began collecting along its rough edges at once. Caleb said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. Silas seemed grateful for that. For a while I hated snow, hated roads, hated every driver who moved too fast and every person who told me the Lord had a plan, as if God needed my girl dead to arrange his calendar. The bluntness startled Caleb. Silas looked across the white hillside toward town. Then, one winter, I found a boy who had slid into a ditch and was too scared to climb out because his father would whip him for wrecking the car. I almost drove past. I had groceries on a bad knee and enough bitterness to keep me company. But I thought, if Hannah were here, she would stop. So I stopped. He brushed the film over the carved cross. Since then, I stopped. Not because it fixes what happened, because it keeps what happened from owning every room inside me. Caleb felt the words settle where he did not want them. He had assumed Silas had rescued him because old men liked being useful, because the dog had made the scene impossible to ignore, because pity had outweighed caution. The truth was heavier. Silas had stopped in the snow because grief had trained him to recognize the shape of abandonment. "You did not know I was Navy," Caleb said. "No, you did not know if I was dangerous. You were unconscious and barefoot. If you planned to rob me, it was a poor opening move." Caleb almost objected, then saw the corner of Silas's mouth. Bishop sneezed into the snow and shook himself, sending flakes over both their boots. Silas looked down. "Also, your partner had already conducted an interview." Caleb rested one hand on Bishop's head. The dog's fur was cold on top and warm near the skin. "Why are you telling me this?" Silas turned from the grave. "Because you are carrying guilt like it is proof of loyalty. It is not. Sometimes, guilt is just a heavy coat you forgot you can take off indoors." Caleb looked at Hannah's name. He thought of the gear, the men who might have worn it, the false report, the stolen name. Taking anything off felt like betrayal. Yet Silas had not told him to be at peace. He had simply shown him a grave and a small wooden cross losing its sharp lines beneath new snow. On the way back to town, they stopped near the church where Grace stored pantry supplies in the basement. A few children were trying to drag a sled piled with firewood across the snowy yard, their boots slipping, faces red with effort. Bishop watched for 2 seconds, then trotted forward without command, stuck his head under the loose rope, and pulled. The sled lurched. The children shouted in delight. Bishop's tail rose, then wagged with cautious dignity, as if he had intended to supervise but found labor acceptable. Caleb stood beside the truck, stunned by the sight. He had seen Bishop track explosives, drag wounded men, hold a line under fire, ignore hunger, ignore fear, ignore pain. He had not seen him become the hero of 3 children in mismatched mittens. One little girl hugged the dog's neck. Bishop froze, then looked back at Caleb for instruction. Caleb nodded. The dog allowed the hug with the grave patience of a decorated officer enduring a medal ceremony. Silas leaned beside him. He has been carrying war longer than you have in dog years. Caleb watched Bishop pull the sled again. He should not have had to. No, Silas said. But he does not seem interested in blaming you. Might be worth studying. At that same hour, more than 100 miles south in Boise, NCIS investigator Claire Donovan sat alone in a field office with a paper cup of coffee gone cold beside her keyboard. She was 36, with shoulder-length light brown hair tucked behind one ear and eyes that had learned to mistrust easy answers. The Caleb Mercer file lay open in front of her, labeled in terms that were tidy official and wrong in ways she could feel, but not yet prove. Men with Mercer's record did not vanish the week before retirement after flagging procurement discrepancies. They did not send vague farewell messages from phones that then went dark. They did not take a military working dog and no boots into a mountain storm for recreation. Claire had once let a neat explanation pass because 3 supervisors and a stack of paperwork told her the case was closed. A good man had paid for that neatness. Since then, she had become difficult in the specific manner of people who have earned their caution. She zoomed in on the logistics timeline again, comparing vehicle GPS logs requested under the broader fraud inquiry. Damon Pierce's company SUV had reported a sensor malfunction the night Mercer vanished. But a third-party roadside camera half-iced over caught a dark shape at 11:42 p.m. near the road north of McCall. The plate was unreadable. The roof rack was not. Claire leaned closer. Her pulse did not quicken much. She had learned not to celebrate crumbs. Crumbs often led nowhere useful. Still, she printed the image, then pulled the weather map from that night. Heavy snow, road closures, poor visibility. A good place to lose a man if you expected the storm to finish the crime. She opened a separate file and typed McCall, Idaho. Nearby clinics, police reports, tow logs, calls about stranded vehicles, service dog sightings. Nothing obvious. Then one local note caught her eye. A plow driver had reported seeing an old green pickup turning from the forest road after midnight, moving slowly, no hazard lights, dog shape visible in the cab. No citation issued, no follow-up. Claire circled it in blue ink, a habit she kept from her father who had been a schoolteacher and believed red made mistakes feel too final. She reached for her phone and called the Valley County Sheriff's Office, asking about green pickups and old men who made a habit of helping people in storms. Back in McCall, Caleb returned to the workshop and found the cracked pine board still waiting on the bench. Silas had drawn a clean blue line along the split, not to erase it, to remember where the board needed attention. Caleb touched the mark. Outside, a truck he did not recognize rolled slowly past Larkspur Lane, its windows black, its tires whispering through new snow. Bishop lifted his head before anyone else heard it, and this time he did not wag. Cold sunlight spread over Payette Lake in a hard silver sheet, bright enough to make the snowbanks glitter, and mean enough to remind everyone that winter had not softened. Outside Silas Whitaker's workshop, icicles hung from the eaves like clear teeth, dripping only when the sun struck them and freezing again before the drops reached the ground. Caleb Mercer stood at the bench with the chair frame clamped in front of him, his borrowed boots finally fitting over thinner bandages. His ribs wrapped his patience, in worse condition than either. The chair was meant for Grace Holloway's diner. That was the official story. The private truth was that Silas had chosen a chair because a chair seemed simple, and because simple things had a way of humiliating men who believed they understood strength. Caleb had measured twice. He had cut carefully. He had sanded until his shoulder ached, and still, when he set the frame on the floor, one leg came down short by a quarter inch. The whole thing rocked with a small, smug click. Bishop, lying near the stove, lifted his head at the sound. Click, click. Caleb pressed one hand against the backrest, testing it again. Click. Bishop sneezed, which Caleb chose to interpret as criticism. Not helpful, he muttered. The old reflex rose in him so fast it nearly felt righteous. Scrap it. Start over. Do not let anyone see the mistake. In teams, a small mistake could kill someone. In the warehouse, a counterfeit plate that looked almost right could become a folded flag. In Caleb's body, the distance between imperfection and danger had been trained down to nothing. He reached for the hammer before he realized Silas was watching. The old carpenter did not shout. He did not snatch the hammer away. He only put 2 fingers on the head of it, light as dust, and said, "That chair has not confessed to a crime yet." Caleb stared at him. "It is wrong. Many useful things are. One leg is short, so was my Uncle Vernon. Still managed 3 marriages and a roofing business." Caleb was in no mood, which made the corner of his mouth moving against his will even more irritating. Silas crouched, slow and careful, and slid the chair beside the window, where the morning sun crossed the floorboards. It rocked once in the light. "Leave it there." Caleb frowned. "Why?" "Because if you destroy every beginning that embarrasses you soon enough, you will not begin anything unless applause is guaranteed." Silas stood with a quiet wince he tried to hide. "Besides, it tells the truth. That is rarer than craftsmanship." Grace arrived near lunch in a blue wool coat with flour on one sleeve and a ledger under her arm. She brought biscuits, not dry this time, and a list of repairs long enough to qualify as a confession. "I only need the 2 tables, the pie case hinge, the back chair, and possibly the shelf over the coffee urn that has been threatening murder since Thanksgiving." Silas took the list. "So the building—" "Do not get dramatic." Grace's eyes landed on the crooked chair by the window. "Oh, I like that one." Caleb looked up sharply. "It is not finished." "Nothing interesting is." She walked over and tested it with one hand. Click, click. "Honest little thing." Bishop rose, trotted to the chair, picked up a short offcut Caleb had trimmed from the bad leg, and carried it under the bench as if removing evidence. Grace laughed so hard she had to steady herself against the door. "Your dog has standards." Caleb should have corrected her. Bishop was not a pet, not in the easy sense. He was a military working dog, a partner, a witness, a line between breath and snow. But at that moment, Bishop looked back with the offcut sticking from his mouth and sawdust on his nose, and Caleb felt the word dog become something warmer than a job title. "He steals bad workmanship," Silas said. "A public service." They went to Holloway's table that afternoon, carrying tools in the back of Silas's truck, and Bishop wedged in the cab like a dignitary refusing cargo class. The diner had been built in 1958 and remodeled never, which gave it the kind of charm money tries and fails to purchase. Red stools lined the counter. Framed photographs of lake festivals, church picnics, and snowplow crews covered one wall. A bell above the door announced them with a tired jangle. Grace moved through the room, greeting people by name, correcting orders, scolding a man for salting soup before tasting it, and sliding a piece of cherry pie toward a widower who claimed every week he was only there for coffee. Caleb stayed near the tool bag at first, back to the wall, eyes mapping reflections in the chrome napkin holders. People noticed him. Of course they did. He was tall, bruised, and followed by a German shepherd whose presence made every child in the room sit straighter. But no one called him deserter. No one whispered loudly enough to be cruel. The old man at the counter nodded once the rural equivalent of a full parade. A little boy asked if Bishop was a police dog. Bishop sneezed on cue, and the boy accepted this as an answer. The repairs began with the tables. Caleb knelt beneath one while Silas handed him screws and advice in equal portions. The table had been shimmed over the years with folded menus, a penny from 1974, and what appeared to be a prayer card. "Grace fixes furniture spiritually first," Silas said. From above, Grace replied, "Prayer cards are cheaper than Carpenter's." Caleb tightened a bracket and felt the simple satisfaction of making wobble become stillness. It should not have mattered. It did. A table steady enough for soup elbows, crossword puzzles, and old men pretending not to be lonely. The work was small, but small was not the same as meaningless. He moved to the pie case hinge, then the shelf above the coffee urn, which turned out to be one sneeze away from collapse. As he worked, he heard pieces of town life. A plow driver complaining about overtime. A teacher asking for extra food boxes for 2 students. Grace promising she would make the Thursday dinner stretch if she had to teach potatoes the miracle of multiplication. Caleb listened from beneath a shelf, screwdriver in hand, and understood that Grace's diner was not just a business. It was an unofficial triage station for the bruises people did not take to doctors. Mason Reed came in at 3, carrying a snow shovel over one shoulder and wearing an orange rescue jacket faded at the cuffs. He was in his early 40s, broad through the chest but drawn around the eyes, with a beard kept short and the cautious gait of a man who had learned to enter rooms by measuring who might ask what. Grace greeted him too brightly, which told Caleb she worried about him. "Mason, this is Caleb," she said. Mason's gaze flicked to Caleb's posture, then Bishop's collar, then the bandages visible above the borrowed boots. Recognition did not show on his face, but it changed the air around him. "Heard you were fixing chairs," Mason said. "Trying to," Caleb answered. "Dangerous trade, apparently." Silence stretched, not hostile, only crowded with things neither wanted to name. Grace solved it by thrusting a tray at Mason. "If you are going to loom, loom usefully." He took the tray without protest and delivered coffee to the counter. Later, when Caleb was repairing the back chair, Mason crouched beside him and pointed to a splintering joint. "That will fail again if you only glue it. Needs a dowel." Caleb looked at him. "You work wood?" Mason shrugged. "My grandfather did. I mostly hold things while other people know what they are doing." It was not much, but it was the first bridge laid down awkwardly in sawdust and diner noise. At dusk, Grace locked the door for the fundraising dinner and reopened it 10 minutes later to a line of people carrying casseroles, canned goods, and cautious hope. The Thursday meals had been struggling for months, but word had spread that the diner needed help, and in small towns, pride sometimes walked slowly enough for kindness to catch up. Caleb planned to stay in the kitchen. Grace had other ideas. "If you can carry that repaired table to the corner, you can sit at it." He found himself between Silas and Mason, with Bishop tucked under his chair accepting contraband meatloaf from a retired school secretary. Conversation moved around him. Snowplow routes, church roof leaks, the rising price of heating oil. Nothing about his case. Nothing until an old veteran across the table raised his glass of iced tea and said, "To the folks who keep chairs from dropping us on the floor." Laughter moved through the room, gentle and real. Caleb looked down at his hands. They still trembled sometimes. They were not steady enough for weapons. They were steady enough to pass bread. That should have felt like loss. Instead, for one strange moment, it felt like being issued back to himself in pieces no command could inventory. Across the street, behind a row of parked trucks glazed with frost, a man in a black parka lifted a phone and took 3 photographs through the diner window. He had been there for nearly 20 minutes, long enough to watch Caleb laugh once at something Grace said, long enough to note Bishop under the table, long enough to see Silas place a hand briefly on Caleb's shoulder as he passed. The man did not look like a hunter, a tourist, or a neighbor. His boots were too clean for the sidewalks. His gloves were thin and expensive. Bishop noticed before Caleb did. The dog's head came up beneath the table, all softness gone. A low growl rolled through him, quiet enough that only Caleb felt it against his leg. Caleb turned. The man lowered the phone and stepped back into the blue evening. By the time Caleb reached the window, only faint prints marked the snow beside the curb, and a dark SUV was pulling away without headlights. Silas joined him, face still. Grace came with a coffee pot in one hand like a weapon she understood. "Friend of yours?" she asked. Caleb stared at the disappearing vehicle. His chest had gone cold in a way the weather could not claim. "No," he said. Bishop pressed against his side, vibrating with restrained fury. On the repaired table behind them, plates sat warm and half full, while outside the first delicate flakes of another storm began to fall. Night settled over McCall with the cold patience of deep winter, and by 10 o'clock the snow had hardened into a silver crust that flashed under the porch light behind Silas Whitaker's workshop. The town was quiet, except for the far scrape of a plow blade, the pop of the stove, and the restless click of Bishop's nails as he moved from window to door and back again. Caleb Mercer had not spoken much since the man in the black parka disappeared from outside Grace's diner. Silence suited him too well. It always had. In the teams, he had been the one who could sit motionless for hours, letting his thoughts become tools, each sharpened and placed where it belonged. But this silence was not planning. It was withdrawal. Silas saw the difference while pretending to sort screws. Grace saw it before she left, pressing a paper bag of sandwiches into his hand with more force than necessary. Bishop saw it most clearly and refused to lie down. Caleb waited until Silas went into the house for the night. Then he packed. Not much. A borrowed shirt, pain pills he did not intend to take unless his feet failed. The black cord from his pocket, the red zip seal wrapped in cloth. He left the sandwiches because taking food felt too much like admitting he expected to survive the idea. Bishop stood in front of the workshop door before Caleb reached it. The dog did not bark. He did something worse. He sat down, squared his shoulders, and stared at Caleb with the moral certainty of a judge in fur. "Move," Caleb whispered. Bishop did not. "That is an order." The dog's ears twitched at the familiar tone. He knew orders. He had lived by them. Run toward explosives because of them, stopped inches from danger because of them, trusted Caleb's voice when gunfire made language stupid. This time, he refused. Caleb felt anger flare hot and clean, easier than grief. "I said, move!" Bishop lowered his head and placed one paw on Caleb's boot. The pressure was gentle. The disobedience was absolute. Caleb's breath caught. He looked at the dog and saw him in the snowbank again, starving, bleeding, standing over him while cars passed. Bishop had obeyed every order Caleb had given him for years. Now he was giving one back. Stay. Caleb gripped the doorframe. Pain burned in his ribs. Shame burned worse. "If they come here," he said, voice low, "Silas pays for what he did not start. Grace pays. Mason, this town." Bishop did not move. The stove cracked behind them. A coal settled. The old chair by the window clicked once in the warming air as if even crooked furniture had an opinion. "He is right, you know," Silas said from the doorway to the house. Caleb turned fast, too fast, and had to catch himself against the bench. Silas wore a gray robe over long underwear and boots without socks, his white hair flattened on one side from sleep. He looked ridiculous and utterly awake. "About blocking the door," Silas added. "Not about the legalities of command. I leave that to dogs." Caleb closed his eyes. "Go back inside." "I would, but a wounded Navy SEAL is trying to escape my shop in slippers and borrowed boots. A man does not get entertainment like that every evening." "This is not entertainment." "No, it is fear wearing a useful hat." Caleb faced him. "You think I am afraid?" Silas leaned on the door jamb, studying him. "I think brave men are often afraid of the wrong thing. Bullets, storms, betrayal, those you seem to understand, being loved by people who might get hurt because they love you. That has you packing sandwiches. Badly." Caleb looked toward the bag on the bench. "I did not pack the sandwiches." "Exactly. Very poor work." For a moment, Caleb wanted to shout. Then the anger collapsed under the weight of the truth. He sat on the bench because his legs demanded honesty before his mouth found it. Bishop immediately moved to his side, victory without celebration. Silas came in and sat across from him, leaving the door to the house open behind him. Warm yellow light spilled over the workshop floor. "When Hannah died," Silas said, "I tried to make myself easy to lose. Stopped answering the phone, stopped going to church, ate standing over the sink so no chair across from me could look empty. I told myself I was sparing people the trouble of my grief. Truth was, I wanted to leave before anyone had the nerve to stay." Caleb stared at his hands. The skin across his knuckles had split from cold and work. "This is different. Usually is. People are watching me. Someone followed us." "Yes?" "Then you know staying puts you in danger." Silas nodded. "Some." Caleb looked up sharply. "And that is acceptable?" "No. It is serious. Those are different words." Silas reached for his blue pencil on the bench and rolled it between his fingers. "You think leaving makes the danger vanish. Maybe it moves. Maybe it follows you until you drop in another ditch and Bishop gets to freeze twice for the same argument. Maybe the people who framed you get exactly what they wanted, a man alone, injured, and too honorable to ask for help." Caleb had no answer because every word found a place already bruised. By morning, Caleb had not left. He had also not slept, but Silas accepted half-victories like a man accustomed to warped lumber. They used the day to prepare, though Silas refused to call it preparing for war. "We are organizing evidence," he said, "and fixing the back door because intruders dislike sturdy hinges." Caleb did not correct the comparison because the hinge did need work. He wrote down everything he remembered about the warehouse: the bay numbers, the crate markings, the forklift path, the smell of the fake heater cells, the sequence of names on the sign-in sheet, the officer with the gold ring whose face remained just beyond memory. He sketched the room where he drank the coffee, the table, the door, the camera mounted above the hall. Bishop lay beside the chair with the red zip seal in view, as if guarding the smallest piece of truth. Silas watched Caleb's hand move across the paper. "You draw like a man mapping exits." "I am. Try mapping entrances too." Caleb looked at him. "Why?" "Because sooner or later the truth has to come in." That irritated Caleb enough that he drew the entrances. Annoyance, he discovered, was sometimes useful if pointed at paper. Grace arrived after lunch with Mason Reed behind her, carrying a toolbox and the expression of a man who had not agreed to this but had been outmaneuvered by a woman with casseroles. "You need a better lock on that side door," Grace announced. "And I need someone tall enough to reach the pantry shelf, so do not look heroic, Caleb. It is unbecoming." Mason set the toolbox down and crouched by the damaged hinge. This door has been kicked once before. Silas lifted his brows. By weather or man? Mason ran a finger along the cracked jamb. Man, or a very determined boot with bad manners. Bishop came to inspect him. Mason held still, letting the dog sniff his sleeve. Caleb noticed the way Mason did not reach for Bishop's head, did not crowd him, did not make the foolish noises people made when they wanted service dogs to bless them. He had worked around service dogs before. "You were a corpsman," Caleb said. Mason's shoulders tightened. Grace went still by the stove. "Navy," Mason said after a moment. "Attached to Marines, long time ago. Not long enough." Mason looked at him then, and something like recognition passed between them. Not friendship yet, but the acknowledgement of men who knew time did not obey calendars. "No," Mason said. "Not long enough." That evening, Grace held another pantry dinner at the church basement because the diner was too small for the number of people the storm had made hungry. Caleb went because Silas went, Bishop went because Caleb did, and Mason went because Grace threatened to feed his portion to the youth choir if he kept hovering outside. The basement smelled of damp coats, chilly coffee, and old hymnals. Folding tables filled the room. A teenage girl served cornbread with grave concentration. An old widower fell asleep sitting upright until Bishop rested his head on the man's knee, startling him awake and making him laugh. Caleb stayed near the wall at first, but Grace put him to work carrying trays, and work left little room for brooding. Mason ended up beside him stacking bowls. "You think they can clear your name?" Mason asked without looking over. "I think they can bury it deeper if I am careless." "Not what I asked." Caleb handed him another bowl. "I do not know." Mason nodded. "Honest answer. Hate those." Later, Mason told him about the friend he lost years earlier because a medkit had been stocked wrong by someone saving pennies in a supply chain. He did not tell the whole story. He did not have to. Caleb heard the missing parts. The Thursday dinner became, without anyone naming it, a room full of people proving that damaged lives could still pass salt, refill coffee, and notice when another person was cold. The power went out at 1:17 a.m. Silas's old wall clock stopped with a soft click, the stove glow becoming the only light inside the workshop. Outside wind drove snow against the windows in sudden hard bursts. Caleb woke instantly on the cot. Bishop was already standing, not pacing, not confused, alert. A low growl moved from his chest. Silas came from the house with a flashlight in one hand and a cast-iron poker in the other, which might have looked foolish if he had not held it like he knew exactly where to put the heavy end. "Transformer," Silas whispered. Caleb listened. Wind, snow, the faint tick of cooling metal. Then a scrape at the back door, soft and deliberate, not branches, not ice shifting. Metal on metal. Someone was working the new lock. Bishop bared his teeth. Caleb reached for the nearest tool, a framing hammer, because it was there, and because his body knew what threat meant even when it hated being slow. Silas shut off the flashlight. Darkness thickened. The scrape came again. Then a whisper from outside, too muffled to understand. Caleb moved beside the door, every injury suddenly irrelevant and every nerve awake. Bishop crouched low, waiting for the gap to open. The blizzard pressed against Silas Whitaker's workshop, as if the storm itself wanted in, rattling the windows, packing snow into every seam, and swallowing the moon until the yard disappeared beyond the porch rail. Inside, darkness held close around the benches and hanging tools. The stove gave off a red pulse. Caleb Mercer stood beside the back door with a framing hammer in one hand, bare breath slow, sore ribs forgotten beneath the clean arrival of danger. Silas waited near the interior doorway, cast-iron poker lowered but ready. Bishop crouched between them, sable body almost black in the stove glow, ears forward, mouth closed. That silence from the dog frightened Caleb more than growling would have. Bishop barked at uncertainty. He went quiet for work. The lock clicked once. The new deadbolt held. Another tool scraped near the frame, careful, patient, belonging to someone who thought old men slept deeply and wounded men stayed helpless. Caleb raised 2 fingers, a signal Bishop knew. Hold. The dog's muscles trembled with the effort. Outside, a whisper came again, then a curse as the tool slipped. Silas's eyes met Caleb's across the dark. The old man did not look brave in the theatrical way. He looked inconvenienced by evil. Somehow that steadied Caleb. The intruder changed tactics. A small pane beside the door cracked with a muffled pop taped first to keep the glass from falling loudly. A gloved hand reached through toward the inner latch. Caleb moved. He caught the wrist, twisted it down against the broken frame and drove the hammerhead into the wood beside the man's hand with enough force to make the message plain. The intruder gasped. Bishop exploded forward, barking now, a sound so deep it seemed to strike the rafters. The man tore free, leaving a strip of glove caught on a jagged piece of glass. Caleb threw the door open before Silas could stop him. Cold slammed into the shop. A dark figure stumbled down the steps into knee-deep snow, heading for the woodpile and the tree line beyond. Caleb took 3 strides after him, then pain lit through his feet and ribs, white and total. His leg buckled. Bishop passed him like a bullet given fur, not wild, not lost to rage, but aimed. "Bishop, hold!" Caleb shouted. The dog drove the intruder away from the trees and toward the stacked firewood, cutting off escape, with a precision that made years of training visible in every step. The man slipped, fell against the pile, scrambled up and flung something small into the snow before fleeing toward the road where an engine coughed alive. Caleb could not catch him. That was the fact. It humiliated him in a place deeper than pride. He tried anyway, and went down to one knee, breath knocked loose, palms sinking into crusted snow. Bishop returned when called, but not before tearing the man's outer sleeve enough to leave dark fabric in his teeth. The vehicle roared away without headlights, tires spitting ice. Silas came onto the porch in slippers and a coat thrown over his robe, looking like a prophet who had been dragged from bed by incompetent criminals. "You bleeding?" he demanded. Caleb looked at the snow beneath his hand. No blood there. Not his. "Not much." "That means yes in several languages." Silas helped him up despite Caleb's protest, and together they got back inside. The workshop looked wounded. Broken glass glittered under the stove light. Snow drifted through the open door. Bishop stood over the cloth he had taken, chest heaving, eyes fixed on Caleb as if awaiting evaluation. Caleb knelt, ignoring his own pain, and checked the dog first. No cuts, no limp beyond the old paw injury. "Good hold," he whispered. Bishop pressed his forehead into Caleb's shoulder for 1 second, then stepped back as if embarrassed by emotion. The thing the intruder had thrown lay near the woodpile, half buried. Silas found it with the flashlight once they braved the yard again. It was a small notebook, Caleb's notebook, the one containing his reconstructed timeline. The one managed to grab it from the bench near the door, but dropped it when Bishop drove him off. The pages were damp around the edges, but readable. Tucked in the torn glove was something else. A black tag stitched with a white mountain logo and the initials HVC. Mason Reed identified it before dawn. Grace had called him despite the hour, and he arrived with a pry bar, a thermos, and a face that made clear he had slept badly for years and saw no reason tonight should be different. "High Valley Contracting," Mason said, turning the tag over. "They do snow removal for private roads, some county overflow, a few government transport jobs when weather gets ugly." Caleb knew the name. It had appeared on one of the logistics subcontractor lists attached to Damon Pierce's shipments, small enough to ignore if a person wanted to ignore things. "Pierce uses them," he said. Mason nodded. Or did. Grace stood beside the stove in boots and a church coat, hair escaping its pins. "So the man who took pictures sent someone to steal your notes, or scare us," Caleb said. Silas swept glass into a pan. "Poor choice. I have been scared before. It made me tidy." When daylight finally touched the snow, the workshop looked both ordinary and changed. The broken pane was covered with plywood. The back door wore fresh screws longer than before. The crooked chair still sat by the window, as if none of this impressed it. Caleb sat at the bench while Grace cleaned a cut across his knuckle with more aggression than medicine required. "You could have been killed," she said. "I was inside. That is not the defense you think it is." Mason leaned against the wall, arms folded. He had stayed after fixing the door, though no one asked. Bishop lay between Caleb and the entrance, gnawing gently on the torn glove, until Grace confiscated it as evidence. Caleb looked around the room and felt the pressure of what he had brought there: broken glass, fear, people losing sleep because he existed in their orbit. "I should have left last night," he said. Silas stopped sweeping. Grace stopped bandaging. Mason looked at the floor. Bishop lifted his head. The room answered before words did. Silas came to the bench and set the dustpan down. "If you had left, that man still would have come. He would have found an old carpenter, a woman with a diner, and a dog-shaped hole in the room. Do not give criminals credit for your conscience." Caleb swallowed. "They are here because of me." Grace tied the bandage. "Then we are here because of you too. That counts." The admission came out later, when Mason and Grace had gone to make calls, and Silas was replacing the broken glass. Caleb stood beside him, holding the frame steady. "I keep thinking about the gear," Caleb said. "Not the case, not my name, the gear." Silas worked the glazing putty with a narrow knife. "Tell me." There was a team scheduled for Alaska training, another preparing for a cold weather deployment overseas. If those plates failed, if those heaters died, if med kits were empty when someone reached for them. He stopped, throat tight. "I was responsible for inspection. I should have opened more crates sooner. I should have seen the pattern." Silas did not answer at once. He smoothed the putty around the pane, Slolazakt. "When Hannah's ambulance was hit, I spent months rebuilding the road in my head. If I had called her that morning, if I had told her to stay, if I had fixed the wipers on her car so she drove that instead. Grief is a carpenter with no mercy. It keeps building rooms you cannot live in." Caleb looked at him. Silas's face was turned toward the glass, but his eyes were elsewhere. "Did it stop?" "No. I learned not to move in." The knife scraped softly. "You found the bad crates. That is why you are here with stitches and a dog who thinks glass repair is suspicious. Guilt can remind a man what matters. Let it do that. Do not let it forge your signature." Mason returned that afternoon with more than tools. He brought a name, a former High Valley driver who had quit 3 weeks before Caleb disappeared, and now worked at a ski rental place under the table because he did not want questions. He saw sealed crates transferred after hours, Mason said. Not enough to prove anything, but enough that he might talk if he believes someone will listen. Caleb studied him. "Why help?" Mason's mouth twitched. "Grace threatened me with community." When no one laughed, he sighed. "Because I know what bad supplies do. Because I spent years telling myself one broken kit was just war being war, and maybe it was not. Because if your case pulls a thread that reaches mine, I want the thread pulled." There it was, the bridge becoming weight-bearing. Caleb nodded. "Thank you." Mason looked uncomfortable, which made the thanks land properly.
Silas wrote the driver's name on a scrap of cedar because paper kept vanishing under tools. Bishop sniffed it,
unimpressed by human evidence that was neither edible nor throwable. Grace called from the diner to say she had spoken to Claire Donovan, the NCIS investigator who had been asking about Silas's green pickup, and that Claire was on her way to McCall despite the pass being ugly. She sounded stubborn, Grace reported. Silas looked at Caleb. Good. We are collecting that kind. Claire Donovan left Boise under a low sky and drove north into weather that would have made a less irritated woman postpone. Snow swept across the highway in pale ribbons. Her wipers slapped time against the windshield. The Caleb Mercer file sat on the passenger seat beside a folder of procurement records, GPS anomalies, witness notes, and the half-blurred image of Damon Pierce's company SUV near McCall. Claire did not yet have enough to clear Mercer. She did have enough to distrust the people who had rushed to condemn him. There was a difference, and in investigations, the difference mattered. Near a lonely stretch of road climbing toward the mountains, headlights appeared in her rearview mirror. A pickup. No front plate visible through the snow crust. It stayed 3 car lengths back when she slowed, then 4 when she sped up, matching her carefully enough to be deliberate and poorly enough to be threatening. Claire checked her sidearm, then her phone signal. 1 bar. Of course. She smiled without humor. Subtle, she said to the empty car. Behind her, the truck's headlights vanished for a moment behind blowing snow, then reappeared closer. Back in McCall, Bishop rose from sleep before the phone rang, ears forward, as if the road itself had whispered that the next piece of the storm was coming. Morning reached. McCall reluctantly filtered through clouds low enough to snag on the dark pines, and the snow outside Silas Whitaker's workshop had settled into a white crust marked by boot prints, paw prints, and the deep, angry scars of the vehicle that had fled in the night. Claire Donovan arrived just after 9 in a government SUV powdered with road salt and snow. One headlight cracked the front bumper, carrying a fresh scrape she had not bothered to hide. She stepped out wearing a navy parka, dark jeans, and boots suited for bad weather rather than office hallways. Her light brown hair was tucked beneath a knit cap, but a few strands had escaped around a face that looked tired in the specific way of someone who had stayed awake by arguing with danger. Bishop saw her first through the window and gave one warning bark, sharp enough to bring Caleb to his feet. Silas looked outside, saw the badge case in her hand, and reached for the coffee pot. "Government," he said. "Either trouble or paperwork. Coffee helps both." Caleb did not smile. His body had gone still, every muscle returning to a world of statements, custody charges, and rooms where the wrong person controlled the door. Bishop placed himself between Caleb and the entrance. The dog had made his opinion of official visits plain. Claire did not march in. She knocked, waited, then opened the door only when Silas called. Snow swirled around her boots and melted at once on the warmer floor. She took in the room quickly. Broken pane recently repaired, old man with, coffee woman from the diner standing near the stove, former corpsman near the back wall, German shepherd ready to remove parts of her if needed, and Caleb Mercer, thinner than his service photo, bruised, bandaged, alive. For 1 second, the investigator in her gave way to the human being. She had stared at his picture for weeks, arguing with the deadness of a file. Seeing him breathe changed the room. She recovered before anyone could use it against her. "Master Chief Caleb Mercer," she said. Caleb's eyes narrowed. "Who is asking?" She opened the badge case and set it on the nearest bench, not stepping closer. "Special Agent Claire Donovan, NCIS. I have been looking for you for 119 days. Bishop growled. Claire looked at him. "And for your partner. Though I suspect he was less interested in being found by me." Grace crossed her arms. "Smart dog." Claire nodded once. "Clearly." Silas lifted the pot. "Coffee." Claire glanced at the cup, then at Caleb. Yes, but I should warn you if this becomes an interrogation, I prefer mine drinkable. Grace made a sound of approval. Silas looked wounded. People have survived my coffee. That is not a standard, Grace said. Caleb did not sit until Claire did. Even then, he chose the chair nearest the wall with Bishop at his left knee. Claire placed folders on the bench, one at a time. She moved slowly, not because she feared him, but because she understood the danger of appearing to corner a man whose life had been dismantled by official-looking people. "I am not here to arrest you," she said. "That could change if you point weapons at me, flee across state lines, or let your dog eat my credentials, but at present, no." Bishop stared at the badge as if considering the third option. Caleb's voice stayed flat. "The bulletin says I deserted. The bulletin says many things that appear to have been assembled by someone allergic to timestamps." Claire opened the first folder. "Your phone sent a message at 1:03 a.m. from a tower south of Boise. At 1:03 a.m., according to local weather and a plow report, I am inclined to believe you were likely being driven toward this town in Mr. Whitaker's truck." Unless you can be unconscious in 2 counties at once, the message is false. Silas set coffee in front of her. Claire sipped and paused. "That is terrible." "Thank you," Silas said. "I make it strong." "You make it hostile?" Grace smiled into her mug. The small absurdity loosened the room enough for truth to enter without breaking all the furniture. Claire laid out what she had. The procurement irregularities were no longer theoretical. Another inspection had found counterfeit plates in crates from the same chain Caleb had flagged. Medical kits were missing critical components. Emergency heaters contained substandard cells that failed in lab-cold tests. Damon Pierce's company had received payments through shell subcontractors, including High Valley Contracting, whose routes passed near McCall the night Caleb disappeared. Security footage from the warehouse had been erased in the exact 12-minute window when Caleb entered the conference room. But a backup camera in a hallway mirror caught a blurred reflection of Bishop lunging against a handler's grip. "He tried to get to you," Claire said, looking at the dog. Bishop did not wag. Caleb's hand found the fur behind his ears. "How did he get loose?" Claire turned another page. "That part is almost funny, depending on your tolerance for chaos." The handler was not his regular handler, and Bishop appears to have opened a poorly latched equipment gate with his mouth after chewing through a nylon restraint. Grace looked delighted. "I knew I liked him." Silas nodded. "A craftsman." Caleb closed his eyes briefly. He saw Bishop alone in the dark, breaking free following scent into storm. "He should have left me." The room stilled. Claire watched him carefully. Bishop pushed his head under Caleb's hand with enough force to make the answer physical. The red zip seal mattered. Claire photographed it, bagged it, and compared the partial serial number to her list. It matched the range assigned to a crate that had supposedly remained sealed in the warehouse until 2 days after Caleb vanished. The glove tag from High Valley also mattered, though less cleanly. Evidence rarely arrived with manners. Mason gave his statement about the former driver and the after-hours transfers. Grace described the man photographing Caleb through the diner window. Silas described the night in the blizzard, including the missing boots and Bishop blocking the truck. "You did not call law enforcement?" Claire said. It was not an accusation yet. Silas met her eyes. "No." "Why?" "Because a man with no boots in a blizzard had either lost them in a way that made no sense or had enemies mean enough to take them." "I chose warmth first." Claire held his gaze for a long second, then wrote that down. "Warmth first," she repeated. "I may quote you. Spell my name right if you make me famous." "I try to avoid making witnesses famous." "Even better." Caleb listened, surprised by the steadiness of it. No one was scrambling to justify him. They were simply telling what happened, one piece laid beside another like boards being checked for grain. At noon, the former High Valley driver arrived through the side door of Holloway's table, escorted by Mason, and looking as if he might bolt if anyone spoke too loudly. His name was Travis Neal, 30, narrow-faced, with red hands and eyes that had not enjoyed sleep recently. Claire interviewed him in Grace's closed back room while Caleb waited in the diner proper, because Claire had made it clear witness contamination was not improved by righteous staring. Caleb hated waiting. Bishop hated it with him. Silas, who had come along carrying a tool bag because Grace's pantry shelf really was leaning, used the time to tighten loose screws under a counter. "You fix things when nervous?" Caleb asked. "I fix things when they are loose. The overlap is common." Grace poured coffee for everyone but Silas, claiming his was a public hazard. Through the back room door came muffled voices. Travis had seen crates transferred from Pierce's contracted storage to a private truck after the seals were logged. He had been told it was a weather reroute. He quit after seeing red seals cut and replaced by a man wearing a Navy officer's ring gold with a dark stone. Caleb's memory sharpened so suddenly he gripped the edge of the table. Gold ring. Tapping near the coffee. The hidden officer had a name now in Claire's file. Commander Aaron Vale, logistics liaison, spotless record, too spotless by half. The call came while Claire was still taking Travis's statement. Her phone vibrated once, twice, then did not stop. She stepped into the diner, listened, and the room changed around her face. "Say that again?" she said. Grace stopped pouring. Silas came out from under the counter with a screwdriver in his mouth, then removed it because even he recognized a serious moment. Claire ended the call and looked at Caleb. "Pierce has moved up a scheduled transfer. A private storage facility outside Boise. We believe Commander Vale is arranging to relocate remaining records and replacement seals tonight. If they clear that unit, we lose physical linkage between the counterfeit gear and the altered manifests." Caleb stood. "I am going." "No," Claire said immediately. "You are not. I know the process. I can identify the crates. You can identify them from photographs. You are injured, formally under suspicion, and the people involved have already tried to disappear you once." "I need you useful, not cinematic," Grace murmured. "I like her." Caleb's face hardened. "Those records clear my name." Claire did not soften. "Those records may also save the next team that opens a crate trusting the label. So you will help me get them properly, or you will help Damon Pierce turn this into a story about a desperate fugitive interfering with an investigation." Silas watched Caleb absorb that. It was not easy. Men trained to move toward danger often suffered when asked to sit still for the sake of victory. Bishop stood with him, ready to follow either choice. Caleb looked at the dog, then at the diner window where snow moved past the glass in slow flakes, less storm now than witness. He thought of the fake plates, the heaters, the missing medical supplies. He thought of Silas's cracked boards, of the blue pencil marking damage rather than hiding it. Evidence had to hold. A story had to stand without wobbling, or men like Pierce would kick one leg and call it useless. Caleb sat down. It cost him. Everyone in the room could see that. Claire nodded once, not triumphant, only respectful. "Good. I need your memory. Bay layout, label patterns. What would be moved first if Pierce panicked?" Caleb pulled a napkin toward him and began to draw. The old training returned, but not as escape, as service. Mason leaned over the table. Grace cleared plates without being asked. Silas found a pencil that was not blue because he said blue was reserved for cracks worth saving. Outside, a dark sedan rolled past the diner slowly, then continued on. Bishop saw it. Claire saw Bishop seeing it. Her phone buzzed again. This time the message was from an unknown number sent to Caleb's stolen account and forwarded through the fraud monitoring system. It contained only 5 words. "Stop digging, or old men suffer." Snowmelt ticked from the eaves of Holloway's table in slow drops, each one striking the metal trash cans behind the diner like a clock counting down with poor manners. The storm had broken into a pale afternoon, but the cold remained sharp enough to turn every breath white. Inside the closed diner, Caleb Mercer sat at a corner table, covered with napkins, maps, procurement printouts, and one blue pencil Silas had reluctantly loaned after declaring the situation officially cracked. Bishop lay under the table, nose pointed toward the door, while Grace Holloway refilled cups no one finished. Claire Donovan stood beside the wall phone and spoke in clipped sentences to federal agents moving toward the Boise storage facility. Mason Reed leaned over Caleb's sketch of the warehouse transfer process, his brow furrowed. No one was pretending anymore that this was simply Caleb's fight. The threat message had turned the room into something more intimate and more dangerous. "Stop digging or old men suffer." Silas had read it twice, then gone to fix a loose hinge on Grace's back cabinet. "Old men suffer from loose hinges too," he said when Grace snapped at him. But his hands had paused longer than usual before picking up the screwdriver. Caleb wanted to be in Boise so badly his body ached beyond injury. Every instinct pulled him toward movement. Somewhere Damon Pierce and Commander Aaron Vale were trying to erase the last physical proof that men had been sent counterfeit protection under labels they trusted. Somewhere crates might be disappearing into a truck that would cross a county line, then a state line, then vanish into paperwork. Caleb could picture the facility from Claire's description and his own memory of the manifest codes. He could picture where Pierce would place the false seals, which bay would be cleared first, how Vale would try to separate the incriminating documents from the gear and claim administrative confusion. "They will move the seal logs before the crates," he said, drawing a rectangle on the napkin. "The gear is bulky, records are small. If I were them, I would take the binder server drive replacement red seals and the bad plates that show the weight difference." Claire relayed it into her phone. "Check office cabinets first, then the climate-controlled room near the northeast corner. Look for red seal stock and independent scale records." She listened, then looked at Caleb. "They found a locked interior office where your sketch said there would be one." Caleb nodded, not satisfied, not proud. Useful. That was all he allowed himself. Mason pointed to the map. "High Valley plows the private access road behind the facility. If Pierce has a truck waiting, he may not use the front gate." Claire repeated that too. Grace stared at Mason with open surprise. "You have been listening to my gossip about snow contracts all these years?" "I listen to everything," Mason said. "I just prefer not to respond." "That is not a personality, that is a weather condition." Silas chuckled from the cabinet. Bishop thumped his tail once, perhaps because Grace's voice had returned to its normal, scolding music. Caleb looked at Mason. "How do you know the back road is clear?" "Because I clear the ski patrol access 2 miles from there on Tuesdays. High Valley drivers brag when they get private accounts with better pay." Mason tapped the map. "There is also an old service spur, not maintained but passable with chains if a person is foolish, desperate, or from Boise." Claire covered the phone. "I heard that." "Then you are one of the attentive ones," Mason replied. The exchange eased the room, but only for a breath. Claire's phone crackled, her face sharpened. "Agents have movement at the rear gate. Black cargo van, 2 occupants, driver refusing to stop." For 10 minutes, the whole diner became an ear. Claire put the call on speaker, and the voices from Boise filled the room in bursts, broken by static commands, tire noise, wind. Caleb sat motionless, hands flat on the table, while every part of him ran ahead in imagination. He heard an agent shout that the van had turned onto the service spur. Another voice reported a second vehicle leaving from the front entrance. Claire snapped instructions with a calm that made obedience easy. "Stay with the evidence vehicle. Mark the sedan. Do not split if you do not have units." Caleb saw the play at once. Decoy and payload. "Pierce is in the sedan," he said. "The van has documents or gear. Vale would not risk being caught with counterfeit plates if he can make a contractor carry them." Claire repeated that analysis. Grace crossed herself quietly.
then looked embarrassed and did it again more deliberately, as if Faith had nothing to apologize for. Silas stopped pretending to fix the hinge.
Bishop rose. The speaker crackled with a shout, then a sound like metal scraping ice.
"Van is off the spur. Driver fled on foot. We have crates in the back." Another voice. "Red Seal stock recovered. Multiple binders. Portable drive." Claire closed her eyes for half a second. Not relief, control. Then she opened them. "Secure everything. Photograph before moving. Chain of custody starts now."
The sedan was harder. Damon Pierce did not flee like a panicked man. He fled like someone who had paid other people to panic for him. He drove at normal speed until he reached a hotel parking structure, abandoned the sedan on the second level, changed coats, and tried to leave through a walkway into a neighboring building. He might have made it if not for a janitor who had seen his photo on an internal alert and decided that men who wore loafers in snow deserved suspicion. Pierce was detained holding 2 passports, a burner phone, and a flash drive taped inside a leather notebook. Commander Aaron Vale was found at home 40 minutes later, not running, which somehow made Caleb angrier. Vale opened the door in a sweater, spoke politely, and asked whether this could wait until morning. Agents found his gold ring in a dish beside the sink and warehouse access cards in a locked drawer. The officer who had tapped the table while Caleb's vision blurred had expected rank to behave like insulation. It did not. Claire's phone kept delivering updates, each one another board placed under Caleb's name, until the floor began to hold. The stolen phone had been recovered in Pierce's sedan. The false message had been routed through it. Lab teams were already comparing residue from the old conference room coffee mug saved because a cleaning contractor had bagged trash during an unrelated audit, instead of discarding it. When Claire finally ended the call, the diner remained quiet. No cheering came. It was not that kind of victory yet. Too many people had almost been hurt. Too many honest supplies had been replaced by lies. Caleb looked down at the napkin map, now smeared with pencil and coffee. His hands were steady, but not because he felt peaceful. He felt hollowed out, like a wall after a fire has been extinguished. Grace set a plate in front of him. Scrambled eggs, toast, bacon. "Eat." "I am not hungry. I did not ask for a weather report from your stomach." He stared at the plate, then at her. Grace's eyes were wet but stern. "You helped stop them. Now do the small human thing that comes next." Silas slid into the chair across from him. "She means chewing." Bishop placed his head on Caleb's knee. Mason took the seat beside him without asking. Caleb picked up the fork. The first bite tasted like salt and butter and the humiliating fact of being alive. Grace turned away quickly, Wiping the counter, though it was already clean. Silas marked the edge of the napkin map with the blue pencil. Caleb looked at him. "What are you doing?" "Marking the crack," Silas said. "This is where the old story starts losing." By evening, official confirmation had not yet cleared Caleb, but the direction of the case had changed. Claire warned everyone that Pierce's people might still try something stupid, especially if they believed intimidating Silas could pressure Caleb. The sheriff increased patrols on Larkspur Lane. Grace organized a rotation of neighbors bringing food to the workshop, which she insisted was not a security plan, merely Christian nosiness with casseroles. Mason offered to sleep in the shop. Caleb objected. Mason ignored him with professional skill. Silas objected too, claiming his spare cot was not built for men who brooded in boots. Mason said he had slept in worse places. "That is not a reason to continue," Silas replied, but he brought extra blankets anyway. Bishop appeared pleased with the arrangement, because more people meant more patrol routes. Around 9, Caleb stepped outside for air. The sky had cleared, stars sharp over the black pines. Snow reflected enough light to make the yard glow. Silas came out carrying 2 mugs, one of coffee and one of hot water, because Caleb had started refusing Silas's coffee under Claire's influence. Traitor, Silas said, handing him the water. Caleb accepted it. Your coffee could violate treaties. Only small ones. They stood together facing the road, where the first night had nearly ended everything. Caleb said, I wanted to be there. I know. Part of me still thinks I should have been. That part of you likes old habits. Caleb breathed in cold air. It hurt in a clean way. I keep waiting to feel cleared. Silas nodded. Paper clears names. Takes longer with the rest. Caleb looked toward the workshop window. The crooked chair stood just inside, visible in the lamplight. What if I get my name back, and I am still not the man I was? Silas took a sip of his terrible coffee and considered. Then perhaps the Lord is not in the business of returning men unchanged, no matter how tidy that would be for paperwork. Caleb let that sit. He had spent his adult life being shaped by missions, by loss, by the needs of men beside him. Now he was being shaped by a dog who refused orders when love required it, a diner owner who weaponized breakfast, a corpsman who listened like weather, and an old carpenter who marked cracks instead of sanding them away. Down the road, headlights appeared, slowing near the entrance to Larkspur Lane. Bishop barked from inside the shop before either man could move. The vehicle stopped. A deputy's cruiser light flashed once, then another set of headlights came behind it, too close and too dark. Silas lowered his mug. Caleb stepped in front of him just as the night split open with the sharp pop of glass breaking from the workshop window. The last snow of the evening hung in the air like ash, and Larkspur Lane flashed blue and white under the deputy's lights as glass scattered across Silas Whitaker's workshop floor. For one frozen second, Caleb Mercer saw everything at once. Silas beside him with coffee spilling dark across the snow, the crooked chair visible through the broken window, Bishop throwing himself against the inside door, Mason's shadow moving behind the workbench, and a dark pickup angled behind the deputy's cruiser with its engine still running. Then training took the scattered pieces and gave them order. Down! Caleb snapped, pulling Silas behind the truck fender. The old man went, not gracefully, but fast enough. Another crack split the night. Not a gunshot, Caleb realized, as wood burst near the window frame. A rock or weighted tool thrown hard, meant to terrify, not kill. Yet terror had its own arithmetic. A deputy shouted, the dark pickup reversed, tires spinning on packed snow. Bishop erupted from the workshop as Mason opened the side door, the dog ignoring the broken glass with a leap that cleared the worst of it. Bishop, stay! Caleb shouted. This time Bishop obeyed, skidding to a stop beside Caleb, body quivering with fury. The pickup fled backward down the lane, clipped a snowbank, corrected, and vanished toward the main road. The deputy, a young man named Aaron Mills, who looked as if he still apologized to speeding drivers, came running with his hand on his sidearm. Everyone all right? Silas looked at his spilled coffee mournfully. Depends how broad a question that is. Grace's car arrived 30 seconds later because, as she later explained, she had seen the cruiser pass the diner and did not trust men to handle trouble unfed. Claire Donovan arrived 2 minutes after that, having been at the sheriff's office reviewing evidence updates. Her face hardened when she saw the broken window. This was fast, she said. Caleb scanned the snow near the road. Tire tracks, 2 sets overlapping, a thrown object near the porch wrapped in duct tape. Mason picked it up with gloved hands and found a message taped around a heavy socket wrench. Last warning. Claire photographed it before bagging it. Grace read it over her shoulder and made a sound of pure disgust. Men who write threats never have decent penmanship. Silas, still crouched behind the truck because Caleb's hand remained on his shoulder, looked up. Can I get off the ground now, or are we honoring procedure? Caleb released him slowly. His heart was hammering, not from fear of the thrown wrench, but from the image of Silas falling, of the old man not rising, of another grave under snow. The attempt backfired in a way threats often do when aimed at people who have spent years being underestimated. By midnight, Larkspur Lane was crowded with neighbors. A farmer parked his tractor at the end of the road as a snowbank with headlights. Two retired teachers brought blankets. Grace coordinated coffee from her diner, forbidding Silas from contributing his own. Mason repaired the window with plywood and wrote measurements on his sleeve when paper ran out. Deputy Mills called in the plate description from the fleeing pickup, and Claire connected it to a High Valley employee who had ignored a subpoena that afternoon. The sheriff, older and less apologetic than his deputy, declared the lane temporarily closed to through traffic, though no one could identify any person who had ever used Larkspur Lane as through traffic, except confused tourists. Caleb stood in the middle of the workshop, watching strangers protect a place that had protected him. It unsettled him more deeply than danger. He understood teams. He understood mutual risk chosen after training, mission briefing, and chain of command. This was different. These people had not sworn anything beside him. They had simply decided an old carpenter's window mattered. Silas saw his expression. "Do not look so surprised," he said. "You fixed Grace's shelf. Town law is clear." The next morning, under a clear, hard sky, the official storm reached McCall. News had begun to leak from Boise. A Navy logistics officer under investigation. A defense contractor arrested. Counterfeit military gear recovered. A missing Navy SEAL possibly framed. Reporters called the sheriff's office, then the diner, then Silas's landline, which he answered by saying, "No, I do not need new windows," and hanging up. Claire moved quickly to keep the case from becoming a circus before evidence was locked. She took a full statement from Caleb on video inside the workshop with Bishop lying beside his chair and Silas sitting just out of frame because Caleb had asked him to stay. Caleb described the warehouse, the false gear, the coffee, the darkness, waking in the snow. He did not dramatize. He did not soften. When he reached the part where Bishop had pressed wet cloth to his mouth in the forest, his voice faltered once. Bishop lifted his head. Caleb rested a hand on him and continued. Claire's questions were precise but not cold. "Did you ever send the message stating you were done? No. Did you voluntarily leave your command? No. Did you remove your own identification, boots, phone, and tags?" Caleb looked at her. "No, and anyone who says otherwise can explain how I plan to hike Idaho barefoot for fun." By afternoon, federal agents had enough to execute follow-up warrants tied to High Valley's local operations. Caleb was not allowed to participate, which he accepted with the facial expression of a man swallowing nails. He did help identify seal numbers from photographs, confirm which plates were counterfeit, and point out that one supposedly discarded crate still had a faint grease mark from the warehouse forklift used the day he disappeared. That detail led agents to a storage unit under a false name. Inside were Caleb's boots, his torn outer uniform, his dog tags, and Bishop's damaged leash. Grace cried when Claire called with the news, then denied crying and blamed onions despite not cutting any. Silas took off his cap and sat down hard on the crooked chair, which clicked but held. Caleb stood very still. For days he had told himself objects did not matter, a name mattered, truth mattered, lives mattered. Then he saw the photograph of his dog tags in an evidence bag, metal dulled, chain twisted, and something inside him that had been braced against disappearance finally shook. Bishop sniffed the phone when Claire showed the picture, then whined softly. Caleb's thumb moved over the dog's head. "They did not get all of us," he said. Bishop leaned into him. Silas from the chair said quietly, "No. They mistook you for something a storm could keep." The formal clearing of Caleb's status came in stages, as official things do, with cautious language arriving slower than common sense. First came the suspension of the AWOL classification, then confirmation that the text from his phone was fraudulent, then a preliminary finding that he had been the victim of abduction and evidence tampering, connected to a procurement fraud investigation. Claire read the update aloud at Holloway's table, because Grace insisted the room where people worried should also be the room where they heard good news. The diner was full that night. Not celebratory exactly, but watchful, in a gentler way. Mason sat at the counter with a cup of coffee he had not touched. Deputy Mills occupied the stool nearest the door, pretending not to be security. Silas ate pie with the concentration of a man honoring a sacred duty. Caleb listened as Claire spoke each sentence, restoring some public piece of him. Yet the restoration did not feel like he had imagined. He did not stand taller. He did not feel clean. He felt tired, grateful, and strangely afraid. If his old life opened its door again, would he know how to walk through it? Bishop lay under the table asleep on his side for the first time since the blizzard, paws twitching at dreams no one could translate. 2 days later, Caleb traveled with Claire to a naval office in Boise for the preliminary review. The morning was bright, the highway lined with snowbanks carved by plows, and Bishop rode in the back seat with his head between the front seats, supervising government driving. Caleb wore a temporary service uniform arranged by Claire, the fabric stiff, the collar too clean. Putting it on had shaken him. Not because he no longer respected it, but because he did. The uniform carried the weight of men he loved, missions he survived, promises he meant. It also carried the memory of how quickly institutions could repeat lies if lies arrived with proper formatting. At the office, officers who had once spoken of him in past tense now avoided his eyes or offered careful apologies. Claire presented evidence. Procurement investigators confirmed the recovered gear. Commander Vale's access logs tied him to the erased footage. Damon Pierce's flash drive contained payment records and draft statements prepared to deepen Caleb's false desertion narrative if his body was never found. The room grew colder as the plan became plain. They had not merely abandoned him in snow, they had intended to let weather become executioner and paperwork become grave. When the review officer finally addressed him, Caleb stood at attention out of respect for the service, not the men who had failed him. His status would be restored, his record corrected. Public clarification would be issued after coordination with prosecutors. A senior admiral appearing by secure video apologized with visible difficulty and offered Caleb a role advising the cold weather gear audit once he was medically cleared. It was honorable work, necessary work, work that might save lives. Caleb thanked him and asked for time. The admiral granted it. Outside the building, Bishop relieved himself against a snow-crusted shrub with magnificent disregard for military ceremony, and Claire laughed so suddenly Caleb looked startled. "Sorry," she said. "Your partner has strong opinions about bureaucracy." Caleb looked at Bishop, then back at the building. "He always has." Claire's smile faded into something kinder. "You do not have to decide today. Everyone keeps saying that." Maybe everyone is right occasionally. Caleb watched snow slide from the roof in a soft collapse. For 22 years, decisions had often been immediate because delay could kill. Now delay might be the first honest space he had been given. When Caleb and Bishop returned to McCall that evening, Silas was in the workshop trying to lift a slab of maple he had no business lifting. Caleb caught one end before it tipped. "You trying to prove something?" Silas looked offended. "Yes, that maple is heavier than it looks." Caleb carried it to the bench. The old man seemed paler than usual, one hand resting briefly against his chest before he lowered it. Caleb noticed. Of course he noticed. "You all right?" "I am 79. That question has become philosophical." "Silas." The old carpenter waved him off. "Just tired." Grace would have scolded. Caleb almost did. Instead, he watched more closely. They worked together in companionable quiet, sanding the maple for a tabletop Grace wanted for the diner fundraiser. Bishop slept near the stove, no longer guarding every sound, though one ear still tracked the room. Silas marked a long, dark crack in the maple with his blue pencil.
"This one stays," he said.
"It will need a bow tie inlay, maybe walnut. Stronger if we do not pretend it is not there." Caleb touched the line. "You say that about everything." "Only everything true." Outside, the snow began to soften into rainless mist, not falling now but lifting as if winter were finally loosening its grip. Caleb turned to ask Silas another question and saw the old man's face go gray. The blue pencil slipped from his fingers, bounced once on the floor, and rolled under the crooked chair as Silas collapsed beside the bench. The morning after Silas Whitaker collapsed, McCall woke beneath a sky so clear and cold that every roofline seemed cut from glass. Snow still covered the town, but sunlight had found its way into the edges, turning drifts soft and bright, making the whole valley look deceptively healed. Inside the county hospital, Caleb Mercer sat in a vinyl chair beside Silas's bed and listened to the steady beep of a heart monitor with the intensity of a man trying to negotiate with machinery. Bishop lay on the floor under the window, chin on his paws, eyes fixed on the old carpenter. Nurses had tried to move him once. Bishop had not growled, not exactly. He had simply become a statue with teeth available. The nurses reconsidered and placed a blanket under him. Silas slept with an oxygen tube beneath his nose, one hand resting above the blanket, blue veins visible under thin skin. He looked smaller in the hospital bed. Caleb hated that. In the workshop, Silas seemed made of the same stubborn material as the benches, worn but permanent. Here, under white lights, he looked like a man whose body had been making quiet sacrifices while everyone admired his spirit. Grace sat on the other side of the bed knitting badly because worry needed something to ruin. "He is going to complain about the food," she said. "That means he plans to stay." The doctor explained it in careful terms. A cardiac event, not the catastrophic kind, but serious. Years of age, winter labor, missed appointments, and what Grace called male nonsense had conspired. Silas would live, but he could not keep working the way he had. No heavy lifting, less cold exposure, real rest, a phrase Silas would later treat as a foreign insult. Caleb listened, nodding, while guilt tried to take a familiar seat in his chest. If Silas had not found him, he would not have been dragged into threats, broken windows, late nights, and stress. Grace saw the thought arrive. She pointed a knitting needle at him. "Do not start." Caleb looked up. "I did not say anything. Your face did. Your face has fewer curtains than you think." Bishop lifted his head, approving of the correction. Grace lowered the needle. "Silas was overworking before you dropped out of the sky in a snowbank. He has been lifting things too heavy for him since Eisenhower." "You are not powerful enough to have invented age." Caleb almost smiled. "That may be the kindest insult I have heard." "Good. I have more." Silas stirred, then, eyes opening to slits. "If this is heaven," he rasped. "The coffee smells suspiciously absent." Grace burst into tears and scolded him at the same time. Bishop stood and placed his front paws gently on the bed rail tail, moving for the first time in hours. Recovery changed the rhythm of everything. Silas came home 3 days later under protest, wearing a knitted cap Grace had forced on him and carrying a discharge folder he claimed contained slander. Caleb set up the downstairs room so Silas would not need to climb to his bedroom. Mason built a temporary rail beside the porch steps. Grace filled the freezer with enough soup to sustain a logging camp. Claire, still in Boise, managing case filings and interviews, sent updates each evening, and once mailed a blood pressure cuff with a note that said, "Use this before Grace uses force." The investigation widened. Commander Vale was indicted. Damon Pierce began negotiating through attorneys which Claire described as what guilty men did when innocence became expensive. Caleb's public correction was released at last. The statement used formal language acknowledging that he had been wrongfully classified and that evidence showed he had been abducted after uncovering procurement fraud. News outlets picked it up for a few days. Some people who had believed the lie sent messages of apology. Some stayed silent. Caleb read them all, then stopped. A restored name was a gift, but it was not a time machine. The men who mattered most had started calling already, voices thick over secure lines, angry for him, relieved, ashamed, loyal. He forgave some quickly. Others would take time. Time, Silas said from his chair by the stove, was one of the few tools people kept misplacing. The Navy's offer remained on the table. Cold weather gear audit advisor. Training role. A chance to make sure counterfeit equipment never reached another team. It was exactly the kind of work Caleb would have accepted without hesitation before the snowbank. He owed the service much. He loved it still in ways anger could not erase. But each time he pictured returning full-time, he also pictured Silas trying to lift Maple alone, Grace stretching soup until it became theology, Mason standing outside rooms he wanted to enter but feared Bishop sleeping with one eye open because Caleb had not yet chosen a place safe enough for both of them. One afternoon, Caleb found Silas at the workshop window, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the crooked chair. "Doctor said you are supposed to nap," Caleb said. "Doctor says many ambitious things." Grace will ask, "Then lie poorly. She enjoys catching people." Caleb leaned against the bench. Dust motes moved in the sunlight like tiny, slow snowflakes. Silas nodded toward the chair. "You ever notice it does not rock as much now?" Caleb looked. The chair still leaned, still clicked if pressed, but the floor beneath it had worn slightly around the feet. Or perhaps Caleb had stopped expecting it to stand like a manufactured thing. Maybe the floor got used to it. Silas smiled. "That happens with people, too." Mason came by that evening carrying a box of old tools from his grandfather's shed. He claimed he wanted to donate them before they rusted, but he stayed after setting them down, rubbing one thumb over a wooden mallet handle. Caleb recognized the posture. A man standing at a threshold he had built himself. "Grace said you were thinking about classes," Mason said. Caleb had mentioned the idea once half-formed after watching Silas sleep through an afternoon he would once have filled with work. A workshop open 2 nights a week. Basic repairs, simple projects, veterans, teenagers, older folks, anyone who needed a place to put their hands to use. "Thinking," Caleb said. "Dangerous stage." Mason nodded. "I might come. To help? To learn?" That mattered. Mason did not look at him when he said it. "I know how to patch a door and brace a shelf. I do not know how to build something I would keep." Caleb let silence respect the confession. Then he said, "First class, we build small stools. Harder to romanticize than chairs." Mason huffed. "Good. I hate romance in furniture." Bishop wandered over, sniffed the toolbox, selected a cracked handle and carried it to Caleb's feet. Silas from his chair said, "Dog has chosen the first student." Grace was next to join without asking permission. She arrived with a ledger, 3 church ladies, and a teenager named Abby who needed community service hours after spray painting a snowplow, which Grace privately considered poor judgment only because the spelling had been bad. "If you open this place 2 nights a week," Grace said, laying the ledger on the bench, "I can feed people first. Hungry hands shake more, also hungry people complain, and I already have Silas." The church ladies began measuring shelves for donated supplies before Caleb answered. Abby stood near the door, hood up, eyes on the floor, pretending not to stare at Bishop. Bishop solved the problem by placing the cracked handle against her boot and backing away. She picked it up. "What am I supposed to do with this?" Silas said. "Find out if it wants to remain a handle." Abby looked at him like he was insane. Caleb understood the look. He had worn it himself. By the end of the hour, Abby had sanded the handle smooth enough to reveal a stripe of darker grain beneath the dirt. She tried not to look proud. Failed. Grace noticed and wisely said nothing, which may have been her most difficult act of charity that week. The official hearing in San Diego came in early spring. Caleb traveled with Bishop and Claire, leaving Silas under Grace's supervision, which Grace described as legally binding whether or not law agreed. The Navy auditorium smelled of Polish uniforms and old air conditioning. Men and women Caleb had served with filled rows quietly. Some had flown across the country, others stood along the walls. The review was no longer about whether he had deserted. That lie was dead. It was about public correction, accountability, and the record. Evidence was entered. Statements were read. Commander Vale's name came up again and again, followed by Damon Pierce High. Valley shell vendors altered, seals, stolen identification, attempted intimidation. Caleb spoke last. He did not give the speech some expected. He did not thunder about betrayal. He did not forgive everyone on command. He described Bishop in the snow, Silas stopping, Grace feeding strangers, Mason choosing to step back into a room where service was spoken of without shame. "My name matters," Caleb said, voice steady. "But so does what was almost shipped under clean labels. I ask that every person down that chain be checked not to protect my reputation, but to protect the next 19-year-old who trusts a plate because someone in authority signed a form." The room stayed silent after he finished. Then the Admiral stood. One by one, others followed. Afterward, the Admiral offered the advisory post again, this time with more flexibility. Caleb could consult part-time from Idaho, travel when necessary, and help rebuild the inspection protocols without returning to full operational life. It was a compromise, and once Caleb would have mistrusted compromise as softness. Now he saw the grain in it. Not perfect, strong enough if joined well. He accepted. Not as retreat from service, but as a new shape of it. In the hallway, men from his old team embraced him hard enough to make his ribs remember they had recently been injured. One apologized for believing the message. Caleb looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Believe the dog next time." The man laughed, then cried, then pretended not to. Bishop accepted several solemn pats and one piece of contraband jerky from a chief who should have known better. Claire watched from a distance, arms folded, expression tired and satisfied. "You did well," she said when Caleb joined her outside. "I did not hit anyone." That was included in well. Snow did not fall in San Diego, but the ocean wind had its own clean bite. Caleb looked west, then north in his mind toward McCall, the workshop, Silas's chair by the stove, and the blue pencil waiting on the bench. When Caleb returned to McCall, spring had begun its slow negotiation with winter. Snowbanks shrank from the roads, brown grass showed in patches like old secrets. The workshop door stood open for the first time in months, letting in air that smelled of thawing earth, wet cedar, and distant lake water. Silas sat near the entrance, wearing his cap and pretending not to be supervised. Grace stood beside him with a clipboard, fully embracing tyranny. Mason had cleared the benches. Abby had painted a sign on scrap plywood in careful letters, "Blue Pencil Workshop." Caleb stopped when he saw it. Under the name in smaller letters, she had written, "Cracks Welcome." Silas looked embarrassed, which, on him, appeared as mild irritation. "Girl has opinions." Grace said, "Good ones." Bishop trotted into the shop, sniffed the sign, and sneezed approval. Caleb ran a hand over the rough painted letters. Something in his chest ached, but it was not the old pain. It was a widening, a place being made. That night he placed his restored dog tags in a small wooden box on the shelf beside Silas's blue pencil and Hannah's carved cedar cross. Not hidden, not displayed like a trophy. Kept where the past could be honored without being allowed to run the room. Outside, the last dirty ridge of snow slid from the roof and landed with a soft thud, as if winter had finally set down what it had been carrying. Spring came late to McCall, Idaho, lifting the snow one careful inch at a time, revealing fence rails, muddy paths, lost gloves, and all the ordinary things winter had hidden without healing. In the mornings, mist rose from Payette Lake and moved through the pines like breath from a sleeping giant. The roof of Silas Whitaker's workshop dripped steadily, each drop striking a bucket Caleb Mercer had placed beneath a leak Silas claimed had character. Inside, the first evening of Blue Pencil Workshop began with the smell of cedar soup, wet boots, and nervous people pretending they had only stopped by out of curiosity. The sign Abby painted hung beside the door, still rough around the edges, Blue Pencil Workshop, cracks welcome. Beneath it, Bishop stood as unofficial inspector, sable coat, brushed black saddle, shining, torn ear-high tail, moving in slow, royal approval. He greeted every arrival with a sniff that felt like judgment, and when satisfied, allowed them to pass. Grace Holloway had set up a soup table near the stove and was already scolding a retired logger for taking bread before washing his hands. Mason Reed stood beside the tool wall trying to look like a man helping rather than a student hiding in responsibility. Silas sat in a sturdy chair Caleb had built for him, blanket over his knees, blue pencil in his shirt pocket, eyes bright despite the body that had finally forced him to accept rest as a tool. Caleb watched from the center of the workshop and felt for a moment the old instinct to command. People were looking at him, waiting. Veterans, 2 teenagers, a widow whose kitchen drawer had been broken since Christmas. Deputy Mills, off duty and embarrassed to be there. Abby, with paint still under her fingernails. Mason, holding his grandfather's mallet like it might accuse him. Caleb could have given a speech about resilience. He could have said the things people expected from a Navy SEAL whose name had been restored after betrayal. Courage, honor, never quit. Those words were true enough, but they had been polished by too many posters until they sometimes slid off the heart. He looked instead at the crooked chair by the window, the first one he had made, still leaning slightly, still refusing to apologize. Silas had insisted it remain there. Caleb picked it up and set it in front of the group. It clicked when it touched the floor. Bishop sneezed, a few people laughed, and the room breathed. "This chair is not an example," Caleb said. "It is a warning with 4 legs." More laughter, including Silas's soft rasp. Caleb ran a hand along the uneven backrest. "I wanted to break it the day I made it. Silas would not let me. He said beginnings deserve witnesses too." He picked up the blue pencil from the bench and marked the short leg. "Tonight we are building small stools. Some will wobble. Nobody throws one away without asking what it is trying to teach." That was how it began. Not with dramatic music, not with a crowd outside, not with a miracle that fixed everyone by bedtime. It began with cheap pine, borrowed aprons, soup bowls, and people learning how awkward their own hands could feel. The retired logger cut one leg too short and swore in a whisper he believed Grace could not hear. Grace heard everything, and made him put a coin in the church jar. Abby showed Deputy Mills how to sand with the grain and took obvious pleasure in being better than law enforcement at something. Mason stood beside a young veteran named Luke who had arrived with a worn backpack and a nervous service dog named Scout pressed against his leg. Luke barely spoke. His fingers shook whenever a tool slipped. Mason noticed without announcing it. He placed his own badly cut stool piece on the bench and said, "Mine looks like it was measured by a sleepy surveyor. Want to trade disasters?" Luke looked at him startled, then smiled a little. Caleb saw the exchange and understood that Mason had crossed a line no one else could push him over. He had stopped merely surviving near the work and started offering his unfinished places as shelter for someone else's. Silas saw it too. He tapped the blue pencil against his pocket, eyes shining. "Good joint," he murmured. Caleb did not ask whether he meant the wood or the men. Over the next weeks, Blue Pencil Workshop found its rhythm. Monday and Thursday evenings began with Grace's soup because she insisted sharp tools and empty stomachs were a theological disagreement. Caleb taught measuring, cutting, sanding, patience. Silas corrected from his chair with surgical timing. Less muscle, Luke. Abby, the saw is not your enemy unless you negotiate badly. Deputy, that clamp is upside down, but I admire its confidence. Bishop became responsible for emotional weather. He seemed to know who needed a nudge, who needed space, and who needed one of his ridiculous offerings. He had developed the habit of bringing flawed scraps to people who sat too long staring at nothing. A knotty piece to Luke, a splintered handle to Mason, a crooked wedge to Grace when she looked at the pantry ledger with too much worry. Grace accused him of commentary. He wagged without shame. Caleb began to understand that Bishop had been recovering too. The dog no longer slept facing the door every night. Sometimes he slept in the center of the room while hammers tapped and people laughed around him. Sometimes he rolled onto his back near the stove, paws limp in the air, a posture so trusting it made Caleb look away the first time because tenderness could be harder to witness than pain. Claire Donovan visited once a month at first, officially, to coordinate Caleb's consulting work on the procurement audit, and unofficially, because Grace had discovered Claire liked blackberry pie. The investigation did what truth often does when enough hands hold it up, it spread. More counterfeit shipments were found and stopped. Inspection rules changed. Contractors who had grown comfortable in shadows discovered that spreadsheets could become search warrants. Commander Vale resigned before trial and gained nothing by it. Damon Pierce tried to trade information for mercy, and the mercy he received was the lawful kind, which disappointed him. Caleb worked remotely with inspection teams identifying weak points in SEAL protocols and teaching younger officers to trust physical sense as much as digital signatures. If the weight feels wrong, stop, he told them over video. If the paperwork is too perfect, slow down. If a dog is trying to chew through a restraint to reach a man, consider listening. That last line traveled farther than he expected. Someone made a sign for a supply office, "Believe the dog." Caleb pretended to disapprove. Bishop, shown a photo of it, appeared bored because humans were always late to obvious conclusions. Silas grew stronger, though never again in the way he had been before. He learned to sit while others lifted. Badly at first, then with improving grace, if grace included muttering. Caleb built him a chair with wide arms, a high back, and a small drawer beneath the seat, for pencils, peppermint candies, and the photograph of Hannah he liked to keep near, without displaying to every visitor. The chair had a visible walnut bow tie inlay across a natural crack in the maple. Caleb wanted to sand it until it looked perfect. Silas stopped him. "Let the repair show," he said. "People trust a thing more when it admits where it needed help." So the inlay stayed dark against the pale wood, beautiful because it did not pretend. On the day Caleb finished it, Silas ran one hand over the arm and sat without making a joke. That worried everyone. Then he cleared his throat and said, "Comfortable enough to encourage laziness. Dangerous." Grace cried again and blamed onions again, though she was holding pie. Caleb placed the chair where Silas could see the whole shop, the benches, the door, the crooked first chair, the students, Bishop, asleep beneath the tool wall, the blue pencil sign hanging outside. Silas looked at it all with a peace that made him appear younger and older at the same time. Summer came green and loud. The lake filled with boats. Tourists crowded the sidewalks. The workshop doors stayed open late, spilling lamplight into evenings that smelled of cut grass and warm pine. Blue Pencil Workshop became known without ever advertising. A pastor sent a widower who had stopped speaking much. A school counselor sent two boys who liked taking machines apart more than attending class. The VA office in Boise called and asked whether Caleb would accept referrals. He said yes after Grace promised she could double soup if people stopped pretending crackers counted as dinner. Mason became the person new arrivals trusted first, perhaps because he never pushed them to talk. He taught tool safety with dry humor and carried extra ear protection for anyone startled by hammer noise.
Abby painted better signs and eventually repaired the snowplow she had once vandalized, adding a tiny blue pencil in the corner where the town manager could pretend not to see it.
Luke returned every week with Scout, and one evening he stayed after class to help sweep. "I did not think places like this existed," he said. Caleb looked around at the mismatched stools, the scarred benches, the old man asleep in his maple chair, the diner owner counting donated cans, the German shepherd dreaming under a rain of sawdust. "They usually do not," he said. "Somebody has to stop first." Autumn found McCall gold at the edges, the mountains brushed with early frost, and the air carrying the first clean warning of snow. A year had nearly passed since Silas found Caleb in the ditch. The anniversary arrived quietly, because important days often do. Caleb drove the same back road one afternoon, with Bishop in the passenger seat and Silas beside him, bundled in a coat, Grace's thermos tucked between his boots because she trusted none of them to hydrate properly. They stopped near the place where the blizzard had erased almost everything. In autumn, the ditch looked ordinary. Grass bent under frost, pines whispered overhead. No sign remained of the man half buried there, the starving dog, the old pickup's tracks. Caleb stood at the edge for a long time. Bishop pressed against his leg, older now around the muzzle but steady. Silas waited, saying nothing. At last, Caleb took a small blue pencil from his pocket and pushed it into the soil near a stone, not as a marker for strangers, but as a private witness. "This is where the crack started showing," he said. Silas shook his head gently. "No, this is where somebody finally saw it." Caleb looked at him. The distinction mattered. Bishop sniffed the pencil, found it inedible, and sneezed on it. Silas laughed until he coughed, and Caleb laughed with him, fully this time, the sound shaking loose snow from the branches. That winter, when the first heavy snow returned, Caleb did not feel the old dread in the same way. He respected it. He prepared for it. He checked tires, stocked firewood, called Grace twice because she kept overworking, and drove slowly past ditches because Silas had taught him that roads were full of stories pretending to be shadows. Blue Pencil Workshop stayed open even when snow piled against the door. People came in stamping boots, carrying broken lamps, cracked picture frames, loose chair legs, and heavier things no one named at first. The crooked chair remained by the window. Under the seat, Caleb had carved a sentence in small, plain letters. "Some things stand because someone refused to throw them away." It was not visible unless a person turned the chair over, which Bishop did once while chasing a dropped biscuit, revealing the words to the whole class. Grace accused Caleb of hiding poetry in furniture. Silas claimed that was a punishable offense unless pie was involved. The line became the workshop's private blessing. On the coldest nights after everyone left, Caleb would sit beside Silas and listen to the stove, the wind, Bishop breathing in his sleep, and the faint settling sounds of wood adjusting to warmth. He no longer needed every noise explained. Some sounds were simply life continuing. Years would carry changes, as years always do. Silas would slow further, then further still, but not vanish from the work he had begun. Grace's diner would survive another winter and then another, because people who had been fed there began feeding it back. Mason would become an instructor for veterans who trusted quiet men more than cheerful pamphlets. Abby would leave for trade school and come home on holidays to repaint the sign. Luke would one day arrive without shaking, carrying a stool he had built for his mother. Claire would send postcards from cases that took her through airports and bad coffee, always adding one line about checking the cracks. Caleb would keep consulting for the Navy, helping protect people whose names he might never know. And Bishop, gray at the muzzle and shameless about naps, would remain the soul of the workshop, accepting admiration only after inspecting whether visitors had food. But the truest ending had already happened on a snowy night when an old carpenter stopped for a dog no one else trusted and a man no one else saw. The world had tried to bury Caleb under weather lies and official language. Silas answered with a coat laid gently on snow. That was all. That was everything. Because one act of mercy offered without proof that it will matter can become a door. And if the door stays open, others will find their way in from the cold. Sometimes the miracle we are waiting for does not arrive with thunder. Sometimes it comes as an old truck stopping in a storm, a bowl of soup placed beside a bed, a hand that refuses to throw away what is cracked. Caleb's life was changed because Silas chose kindness before certainty. That is a lesson worth carrying into our own days. We may not be able to fix every injustice or heal every wounded heart, but we can stop. We can notice. We can offer warmth before questions and patience before judgment. God often works through ordinary hands, especially hands that are tired but still willing. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope. Comment Amen if you believe one small kindness can become the beginning of a new life. May God bless you and your family with peace, courage, protection, and the wisdom to see the people He places on your road.